The dungeon is a place that appears when the gates open. Inside the dungeon, there live many dangerous and diverse monsters. It was also a battlefield where hunters, superhumans with inexplicable superpowers, hunted and demonstrated heroic strength. In the 10 years since the gates first appeared, hunters and ordinary people have learned to coexist, and the popularity of hunters has gradually increased. However, there was only one way to become a hunter. You had to climb from the first floor of the tower to the 100th, and at the same time become stronger. Before awakening, all hunters are summoned to the tower, become superhumans, and transform into hunters who will fight in the dungeon. All the hunters said that one must climb the tower as high as possible, because then a person will gain even more power. However, there were more than 80% of people who couldn't even pass the tower training. Depending on the different floors, which had different difficulty levels, hunters were given different ranks from E to A. Well, the main character at some point found himself in front of the 100th floor and planned to conquer it. He had some small scratches on his face from the previous battle, and his armor was a little broken, but the boy was still determined. Some time ago, our main character was looking at the screen of his phone with delight. Looking at the picture of a hunter named Hans, who was an S level, the guy said that Hans was too good looking in everything. It was also known that during all this time, Hans was able to climb more than halfway, 61 floors. Suddenly, the guy's admiring gaze became somehow thoughtful and cold. Our hero wondered if he would ever be able to receive the tower's call and end his vile life. A feeling of melancholy washed over the boy, and he suddenly remembered how he used to spend time peacefully with his family. He also remembered his friends, who were no longer around. The boy's thoughts were interrupted when someone suddenly hit him on the head from behind, causing discomfort. Turning around, our hero saw the one who hit him on the head and said with displeasure that the red-haired man was constantly looking at his phone. Pointing his finger at his forehead, the dark-haired guy said that all losers behaved like that, and then asked if our hero knew that they would soon be going underground to clean up. Suddenly, another guy approached our hero and apologized for the behavior of his friend, who was unable to choose his words. Hearing this, our hero waved his arms in different directions and said that there was nothing wrong with it. The inventory clerk's positive reaction satisfied the guy, but he didn't express it in any way. When all three guys went forward, our hero was already loaded with equipment that he was obliged to carry. After some time, they were all moving through the forest, Nick walking ahead of them all. Although it was strange for him that he was released forward, because a monster could appear and he was like cannon fodder. However, turning around, he saw the same guy who had apologized smiling sweetly at him. This made Nick breathe a sigh of relief, and he was glad that he had such a good guy on the team. But the very next moment, Nick was kicked forward by that same guy. Due to the strong push, Nick fell to the ground and dropped one of the bags that he had been holding in his hands. After the fall, he turned around worriedly and asked the guys what they were doing. Looking at his companions, Nick saw that they were using defensive mana. Suddenly, that same smiling guy took out his phone and, saying that the long-awaited dogfights had returned, began filming what was happening. Hearing some noise behind him, Nick turned around and saw that someone was approaching him. It turned out that several beast-type monster hounds had approached the guy from behind, gathering in a pack and posing a threat. While Nick stood up and looked at the three dogs, the guys behind him told the viewers to place bets and support the broadcast with their donations. Hearing about how there had been no dogfights for too long, Nick realized that it was all a trap. Dogfighting is a fight in which an ordinary person or hunter is placed together with a monster and forced to fight until one of them dies. But since these fights were illegal, Nick understood that those bastards would not leave him alive even if he won. Clenching his fist, Nick finally understood why these guys had so much bigger rewards than the others. As the dogs slowly advanced forward, the noise from their paws increased the tension in the atmosphere. Suddenly, the first dog pounced on Nick, and the boy could only step back in fear and scream. However, at the last moment, Nick managed to pull out his dagger, which he held in front of himself, and suddenly someone's blood appeared. When the dog moved away, Nick lowered his eyes and touched the scratches left by the dog's claws. Watching his own blood flow, the boy didn't understand how he could fight such monsters. The next moment, he looked up and saw one of the dogs jump high into the air. Suddenly, the guys who brought Nick here told him to cheer up for the sake of the spectators who had already placed their bets. By that time, the guy already had scratches on his face, and he was trying to hold back the dogs with his hands. The moment someone asked if he was going to become monster food like his parents, Nick immediately tensed up. Gritting his teeth and with hatred, Nick called them bastards. Turning around at them, The guy sternly said that they would all die today. The guys just laughed at his words and said that he was the only one who would die today. Ignoring their words, Nick grabbed the whistle that was around his neck. Taking out a whistle, he blew into it and created a sound that surprised everyone present. Because of the loud noise, the dogs also immediately tensed up and began to growl with displeasure. Noticing something was wrong, the watching guys told Nick to stop and were very scared. After passing through the defense mana, they decided to run up to Nick and told him to stop causing aggression. One of them reached out to the guy and demanded that he give up the whistle. However, he did not notice how one of the hounds sank its teeth into the outstretched hand. Following one dog, many others appeared who also wanted to pounce on the guy. A few moments later, the bitten guy and his two friends found themselves surrounded by dogs. When people started screaming, Nick smiled and reminded them of his words. But suddenly he heard someone barking from the side and abruptly turned his gaze in that direction. Raising his head, he saw a huge dog attacking him with its mouth open. Noticing the threat, Nick attempted to dodge. However, he was unsuccessful, so the dog sank its fangs into the boy's shoulder. After a while, an exhausted Nick tiredly opened his eyes, lying on the ground and looking forward. He saw that the dogs had torn his companions to pieces, and also that some dogs were crowding around him. Closing his eyes, Nick thought about how he tried his best to survive, but ended up becoming food for the monsters. Suddenly, Nick saw a notification that the conditions had been met and the tower was inviting him. When the guy woke up, he was lying on his back on the hard floor in the middle of an open and empty hall. Opening his eyes, he abruptly shifted his body position to a sitting position and looked very alarmed. As he replayed in his head the last events that happened before he lost consciousness, the guy wondered why he hadn't died, even though he should have. Then the guy again felt that the tower was inviting Nick. Still sitting on the floor, Nick wondered about being summoned to the tower and resurrected for coins. It turns out there were coins that allowed you to come back to life if you died inside the tower. Regardless of what kind of death it was, a person could still return to life. Then Nick thought about what they said. Each person has a different number of coins, and their number can only be found out after completing the training. When the greeting notification appeared in front of Nick, he was very surprised by it. Immediately, thanks to those notifications, he learned that he was now on the first floor of the tower, and the training was taking place on the first 5 floors. Looking at the status window, the guy thought that now he really believed that he had gotten into the tower. It turns out that for this day, Nick was finding out information provided by the government and the guild. He also prepared diligently, training his body with various physical exercises. Looking into the portal, Nick thought that now he finally had an opportunity, and before starting, he needed to concentrate. And a few moments later, Nick stepped into the portal, thinking that such a chance could not be missed. After passing through the portal, Nick found himself in the middle of the forest, where he immediately saw a goblin sitting in a clearing. When the goblin noticed the guy, he immediately rose to his feet and twisted his mouth. Seeing the notice that one goblin needed to be killed, Nick was glad that the information from the guild and the government was correct. After this, the goblin smiled menacingly and beckoned the guy to him with one finger. Nick immediately didn't like this behavior of the monster, which made him look irritated. Having pulled out his dagger, the guy said that it would be better if he dealt with the goblin right away on the spot. The next second, Nick lunged, putting his knee out and hitting the goblin, who didn't have time to react and defend himself. When our hero landed, the goblin flew back and hit his back on the ground. Running up to the goblin and grabbing him by the neck with his hand, Nick raised his other hand up and was about to kill the goblin. The next moment, without any hesitation, Nick delivered one blow to the goblin's chest. When the dagger was in the monster's chest, the system considered the condition fulfilled. After removing the dagger from the monster's chest and standing up, Nick said that it was easy. Wiping the sweat from his face with his hand, Nick wanted to say that it was easy to deal with. But suddenly he heard a sound. Another goblin approached the guy unnoticed and plunged his weapon into our hero's side. When Nick felt pain and saw that he was wounded, horror and fear were reflected in the boy's eyes. After receiving the blow, Nick immediately fell to the ground and tried to crawl back. Looking at the goblin, Nick thought with horror that there was another goblin here. Before his death, Nick recalled with annoyance that according to information, there was only one monster. Afterwards, he closed his eyes, and then he lost another coin. After reviving, Nick sat down and thought about how the training rules only specified one goblin. This led the guy to the idea that the government and the guild had spread false information. Nick didn't understand who was doing this and for what purpose. But now he couldn't do anything about it. Having passed through the portal again, our hero thought that now it was time to get up. 3 hours later, Nick sat down behind the bushes and thought that not a single goblin had appeared the entire time. But he couldn't act rashly, because he didn't know how many goblins there were here. When he heard a rustling sound to the side, Nick immediately turned his gaze there. Then he suddenly noticed that one goblin joyfully headed in a direction unknown to our hero. At that moment, Nick decided that it would be best to follow the goblin unnoticed. After some time, without realizing it, the goblin brought the boy to their fortress. Continuing to watch, Nick immediately saw the goblin who killed him last time. But something else made the guy's gaze immediately turn surprised. Seeing a small statue, Nick thought that it was some kind of artifact. But according to the information, they shouldn't be here. Suddenly, Nick remembered Hans's words that there were hidden treasures and opportunities in the tower, and only by using them could one rise high in the tower. Armed with a dagger, Nick thought that no matter what happened, he had to get that statue. Finding the right moment, the guy rushed forward with a dagger in his hand. Suddenly, the expression on one of the goblin's faces twisted. It was because Nick's dagger had pierced that goblin's chest. The second goblin, who killed the guy the first time, turned in the direction from which the dagger came. It turned out that at that moment, Nick was already very close, and raising his hand up, he said that this was revenge for the fact that he was stabbed the first time. When the massacre of the goblins was completed, the first floor was passed. But Nick looked thoughtfully at the statue. Thinking that the goblins seemed to be protecting the tower, Nick picked it up. As soon as the guy took it with both hands, the statue immediately began to shake. And soon, out of nowhere, a wind and a golden light appeared, which enveloped the guy. After a few moments, the statue began to break and golden color began to pour out of it. After the statue broke, Nick saw notifications about a hidden quest whose reward was the lunatic's destiny. As a reward for completing the quest, Nick received eyes that gaze at the stars. Nick was very surprised when he learned that he had received S-level powers. In fact, the highest and most accepted level was that of the S-level hunter, Hans. However, Nick was able to gain powers beyond his level, which was crazy. Thinking about how to use this ability, Nick delved into studying. Realizing that by using this power, the guy would be able to collect all the rewards in the tower, Nick decided to move on. As soon as Nick entered the second floor, he immediately felt a sharp pain in his body. Turning his surprised gaze in that direction, he saw that his blood had just been spilled. Having appeared on the second floor, Nick immediately began trying to escape from his pursuer. As Nick continued to run away, he was unhappy that the government and the guild were lying about their information. It turns out that Nick didn't know that the kobold our hero had to deal with was using a weapon. Hiding, Nick thought that he had already been caught on the first floor, having trusted the guide. Touching his shoulder where the dart was sticking out, the boy said that he should have thought about the variable. Nick decided that the most necessary thing now was regeneration, after which his wound began to heal. Holding the bottle of medicine in his hand and looking over his shoulder, the guy thought that it was already better. Leaning his hand against the tree, Nick said that the monster had a good sense of smell and a weapon, so he had to be careful. However, the guy felt something on his right hand, which caused him to turn his gaze to it and examine it. Not understanding what kind of substance was in front of him, Nick decided to use his eyes that looked at the stars. Our hero immediately discovered that the sap of the facade tree emitted a scent that was difficult for the kobold to detect, and it was worth applying this sap to the body. While Nick was searching for information using his ability and applying juice to his body, the kobold walked around the area and looked for the guy. It turned out that Nick was hiding in a tree with a knife, but the kobold couldn't smell him because of the tree sap that the guy had smeared himself with. Hearing some sound behind him, the monster turned around abruptly. However, Nick was very fast, and the kobold did not have time to react and dodge the guy's attack. When Nick struck the monster, he looked very confident and did not hesitate. Having plunged the dagger into the monster, the guy almost immediately pulled it out sharply, causing serious injury. Getting up from the monster, Nick thought about the fact that the kobold really couldn't smell him. Immediately after this, Nick received a notification that he needed to pick up the claw from his ring finger, and then maybe something good would happen. Having decided to follow the instructions, our hero immediately took the required claw. When the new portal appeared, Nick thought that it seemed like he hadn't left anything on this floor. But he immediately learned that the training area also provided food and water for their efforts. Having decided to eat the offered food, Nick remembered what they had said about the events that took place after the second floor. The next second, the guy's thoughts came true, because he discovered a community whose main server was Korea. Upon opening the chat, Nick immediately read someone's complaints about the fact that there was more than one goblin on the first floor. At that moment, thanks to that message, Nick realized that he wasn't the only one who had gone through this. Noticing the discontent and disagreements in the chat, our hero concluded that people did not believe what others were saying. But immediately after that, Nick thought that it would be good for him to join the community too. Without thinking twice, Nick immediately decided to register a nickname and called himself a childish name, a beautiful princess. Our hero believed that he could attract people's attention with posturing and childish messages and get people who knew about the false information to react. Soon, comments began to appear from people who had also been through this, and Nick felt that this would help him find allies. But in order to publish accurate information faster, Nick decided to move faster. When Nick entered the third floor, he received a notification that he needed to go through all the traps. When the guy heard about this, he immediately turned pale with fear and horror. When something suddenly flashed before the guy's eyes, Nick immediately tensed up and became scared. It turned out that huge spears had appeared from the floor right in front of his face. Frightened by this unexpected move, Nick fell to the floor and backed away. At that moment, he said that he had just escaped death, but he still did not understand how many traps awaited him ahead. Then, sitting on the floor, he remembered that the false guide said to put your hands in front of you to spot traps. Realizing that they were lying in order to deprive the players of their hands first, Nick became angry and decided that nothing would go according to their plan. The next moment, he activated the eyes that were looking at the stars. An unknown symbol immediately appeared behind Nick, and a bluish glow appeared around him. And after a few moments, our hero was able to find the location of all the traps. The third floor contained a large number of traps, each of which was deadly. After some time, Nick was able to walk the entire floor and sat down near the portal to rest. Thinking that at least this time they gave him a filling and good lunch, Nick decided to open the food box. Having started to eat the food, the guy sighed heavily and thought that those traps were really terrible. One of the terrifying traps was an old pendulum clock, which Nick successfully passed. There was also a bright fire show trap that Nick quickly ran past. When the blade trap came across, our hero had to jump high. Holding his lunch in his hand, Nick suddenly thought that if he didn't have this ability, he wouldn't be able to get through this floor even with 100 coins. Suddenly, a ringing sound was heard from somewhere above, which the guy immediately noticed. Seeing his stats, the guy remembered the words about how people were born with magical powers, and Nick's stats were supposed to be the highest among the newcomers. With the thought that he could be talented, the boy stuffed the spoon with food into his mouth with satisfaction. The next moment, Nick decided that he should try to go on with the same good mood. Charles, who was a member of the Sangun Guild, said that there was 1 coin left if you logged out as a C-level player. He knew that the guild chairman would most likely try to kill him because the man knew too much information. Suddenly, someone burst into the room and asked anxiously if Charles had seen the post in the community. Then the newcomer reported that someone was causing a stir again in the training area channel. Charles said with displeasure that his head was already hurting, so it was worth just showing him. Charles thoughtfully read the post about the traps that were in the first half of the third floor. When he read about what was in the second half, he became even more angry. But when he saw the call not to believe the information from the government and the guild, he could not contain his anger. Unable to contain his aggression, the man violently struck the table, breaking it in two and frightening the other man. As the wood chips from the table flew in all directions, the man turned to Charles with concern. Charles furiously gave the order to find the author of the publications, after which the man ran away. In his anger, the man thought that if he didn't settle this, his head would be cut off. Not understanding how that man dared to show off, Charles decided to kill that man. Seeing the announcement notice, Nick wondered if anyone had mentioned it. Then the guy carefully read the information that he helped the followers, which is why he was given the title of Conqueror. Upon hearing that he had been awarded the title, the boy spat out his drink in surprise, unable to control his emotions. Our hero was surprised that he was given a developmental title, which raised all indicators and had a reward system. After reading people's happy comments, Nick concluded that the title was given due to the positive reactions of others. Because their opinions coincided, Nick hoped to become comrades with them, but he did not yet know what kind of people they were. However, in addition to the positive comments, Nick also saw those that said the third floor wasn't all that difficult. Someone was constantly stirring up trouble. The guy's mouth twisted at the thought that people did this out of fear that it would be revealed that the information was false. However, our hero was pleased with himself at the thought that he could expose all their lies himself. During this time, Charles managed to smoke a large number of cigarettes due to nerves. Nick was wondering if anyone would be able to follow him, as he intended to become stronger during this time. Suddenly, on the third floor, there was a hidden place, a hellish pit. However, at that very moment, Nick discovered 3 hidden artifacts: a clockwork part, a level A secret jewel, and a level A explosive scroll. When Nick got to the 4th floor, he had to climb a rock. Then he noticed a dark blue tree that needed to be pulled out, and then maybe something good would happen. Seeing this notification, Nick cried out joyfully that this was true and he had been expecting it. When the 4th floor was completed, he was glad that there were no coincidences with the guide. Falling to the ground, he was indignant that the guide did not mention that the height of the cliff was controlled by the artifacts available. Suddenly, the guy's gaze fell on a stone that was magical and had some kind of inscription on it. Nick picked up the stone and read that it had a name written on it: John Traylor. In fact, John Traylor was a great sage and long ago climbed to the 92nd floor and was able to create a homunculus. But Nick knew that no one had ever gone above the 64th floor, and there was also a previously unknown homunculus. All this led Nick to the idea that the tower existed even before it became known. Thinking about all this, Nick scratched the back of his head thoughtfully. Having started to examine his bags, the guy decided that there was no point in thinking about it now, because he wouldn't find out anything anyway. Walking towards the portal, our hero said that if he climbs higher, he will gradually learn everything himself. There was a look of determination in Nick's eyes as he prepared to begin the final floor of training. On the 5th and final floor of the training, you had to deal with a boss monster. The news that he could use his abilities made Nick very happy. But suddenly a notification appeared about increasing the difficulty due to the fighter's level, and a huge high-class monster appeared in front of Nick. Seeing such a giant in front of him, Nick thought that it was too much. The fish warrior was a sea-type monster and its power was reduced on land. However, upon hearing that the monster was 3rd class, Nick was very surprised. Without giving the guy time to think, the monster pounced on him with its mouth open. However, the monster struck with its trident, which Nick was able to dodge and survive. When the monster tried to grab the guy with its hand, Nick also managed to react and ducked. Looking up at the enemy, our hero wondered if this was really a light version, if the monster's level was so different from those Nick had encountered before. Trying to save himself, Nick began to run away, but the monster furiously pursued him. Using his vision, Nick said that he couldn't win with his bare hands, so he needed abilities. Using his vision, our hero managed to find the location of all the skill boxes. To begin with, the guy decided to pick the skill boxes that were closest to him. As Nick ran towards the 2 boxes, he was very hopeful that they would contain good abilities. Reaching forward, our hero gave the command to open the box. When gray smoke appeared ahead, obscuring the view, the monster was a little surprised. The smoke screen caused the monster to stop, and Nick was a little pleased that he had blocked the enemy's view. However, when the fish warrior screamed loudly and cleared the smoke, Nick immediately began to run away. He immediately decided to head to the next box. Nick ran at full speed and almost managed to reach his goal. However, it turned out that the fish warrior made a jump and almost managed to catch up with the guy. Landing and raising dust into the air, the monster was immediately able to grab Nick with one hand. At that moment, Nick was only indignant that the monster was too fast. Taking out his sword, Nick decided to try to attack the enemy and plunged it into the warrior. The dagger went very deep into the skin, and the pain was immediately reflected on the monster's face. The next moment, Nick was thrown to the side in anger. After rolling on the ground for a bit, the guy broke it. Enraged, the fish warrior swung his trident and growled at the boy, preparing to kill him. But by extending his hand, Nick was able to activate the box to which the monster had involuntarily thrown the guy. Just as Nick was rejoicing over the fact that he had received a firebomb, a new danger was approaching him. The fish warrior decided to kick the guy, but our hero put his hands in front of himself, trying to block the blow. But despite this, the monster's kick was too strong, causing Nick to crash into a rock. The powerful impact also caused a hole, which was caused by Nick's body colliding with the rock. Wiping the dirt off his face, Nick said that the fish had a bad character, because the guy wasn't even given the chance to be happy. However, it turned out that at that moment the fish warrior was already nearby and again swung his trident at our hero. However, the monster was surprised when Nick stabbed him in the leg. Looking at the monster, Nick mockingly asked if it hurt. But immediately the monster screamed in such pain. Enraged, he tried to hit Nick, but the guy managed to dodge. As he prepared to strike, Nick said that it would hurt even more this time. And the next moment, he set the monster on fire, taking advantage of the enemy's hesitation. A hole appeared in the warrior fish's body from the explosion, causing him to fall to his knees and try to touch the place where it hurt. Standing next to the monster, our hero grinned at the smell of fried fish. Reaching out his hand to the monster, the boy said that fire was the best way to catch fish that had come ashore. After that, he said goodbye to the monster and set it on fire again. A few seconds later, a notification appeared that Nick had defeated the invincible enemy. After this, the guy tiredly fell to the ground and said that he had won. But immediately he raised both hands up and joyfully repeated that he had won. The reward was given out depending on the level of the killed monster, and Nick's reward had already been determined. At that moment, such a bright light appeared that Nick had to shield himself from it with his hand. And the next moment, something unknown fell right on the guy's face. Surprised, he picked up the unknown object and asked in surprise what it was. Taking a closer look, he immediately saw a frog. He was given a pet. Suddenly, the frog hit the guy in the face, causing Nick to be surprised by such a strange reward. Afterwards, the frog jumped out of the guy's hands and sat on the ground, staring at him. It turned out that the frog in front of Nick was a chaos frog, and because of this, its further development could not be known. When the notification came out that the frog was stronger than its owner, Nick was surprised by this. While the frog yawned, Nick read tips on how to best behave with a pet. Our hero was immediately surprised that the pet could even bite, and the frog was stronger than its owner. While he was thinking about everything, the frog spat something out on the ground. Her saliva landed on a small stone, which immediately dissolved in the acid. Looking at the frog, Nick admitted at that moment that it was stronger than him. Reaching for his things, Nick said that there was no law requiring one to be with a pet. Taking his things, Nick happily said goodbye to the frog, saying that she could live happily ever after. At that moment, the frog silently and thoughtfully looked at the retreating figure. At some point, she suddenly puffed out her cheeks, as if she wanted to spit at Nick. At that moment, the guy, standing with his back to the frog, wondered if she would spit at him. However, the frog immediately jumped onto the guy's shoulder with a satisfied sound. The thought that the frog was vulnerable and weakened when pushed away brought a smug smile to Nick's face. Looking at the frog and extending his hand to her, Nick said that they should respect each other and become good friends. And the next moment, the two of them entered the portal, heading to the next floor. When our heroes moved to the 6th floor, they found themselves in the middle of a crowd, and the frog was croaking contentedly. As Nick walked straight down the street, he received notifications that he was now in a safe zone and all his wounds were gradually healing. Seeing how many people were there, Nick was surprised that so many were able to complete the training. But suddenly he felt his pet begin to fidget on his shoulder, so the guy turned to look at the frog. At that moment, Nick asked why the frog had started acting like that again, and reminded him that they had agreed to be friends. Suddenly, the boy decided to ask the frog what her name was, because he couldn't just call her a frog all the time. When he heard from her that he himself had to give the name, he wondered what one could name a frog that belonged to chaos. When the boy finally came up with a name, the frog couldn't wait to hear his name. But when the frog heard that he had been given the name Darren, he was immediately upset. When Nick proudly announced that his pet was now a chaos super frog named Darren, the pet was horrified. When the frog got angry, Nick started joking that she was so happy that she even jumped. But suddenly, someone approached our heroes. The smiling man greeted him politely and asked if Nick had just completed his training. Having received a positive response, the guy introduced himself as a member of the Blue Dragon Guild and presented Nick with a white granule that healed well. Using his gaze, Nick immediately found out that the pellet had been enchanted with an oblivion spell, as well as memory editing. Then Nick's face darkened, because he realized that the people who were raising doubts in the chat were the ones who had tried this pellet and lost their memories. Understanding why the government and the guilds were introducing these pellets, Nick asked the guy if he had eaten this pellet too. Taking the pellet from the guy, Nick received a positive answer, arguing that this guy was engaged in distributing pellets. Then the guy smiled and asked again if Nick would eat this pellet for healing. Surprised, Nick asked if it was really necessary to do this in front of this guy. The guy replied that according to the rules, this had to be done in front of the person who had given out the pellet. But at that moment, a pillar of light appeared out of nowhere. Suddenly, the wounded guy shouted that they promised that there was only one goblin, but it turned out not to be so. While the guy was ranting about how the government and the guild were lying, Darren looked at the pellet in Nick's hands. Having thought of something, the frog made a contented croak. He then abruptly snatched the pellet from Nick's hands, who wanted to ask if the guy was on the first floor. However, he did not have time to finish his question, because he was very surprised that the granule suddenly disappeared. At that moment, the guy from the guild turned to Nick, wanting to check if he had eaten the pellet, and Nick replied that he had just eaten it, and when he asked him to state his name, Nick gave a made-up name. John. Once in the living room, Nick was glad that thanks to his pet, he was able to cheat. Nick breathed a sigh of relief and wondered if this would allow Darren to recover more quickly. Suddenly, Nick began to think that the guys he saw in the community would soon also have to go up to the 6th floor. Then he decided to quickly write to the community about passing the 5th floor and the white granule. Having decided that he couldn't afford to lose those who trusted him, Nick took out some book. Having placed it in front of him, the guy was ready to open the guidebook and begin studying it. At that very moment, a bright light began to emit from the book, and the guy received notifications that the ban on the store had been lifted. The next moment, Nick saw before his eyes a multitude of artifacts and weapons to choose from. Suddenly, the guy's attention was drawn to the armor, which had poor properties. But the guy's gaze reacted to this object. When a guy bought an item and 2,000 points were deducted for it, Nick was outraged that the price was so high and a refund was not possible. Nick immediately recognized that this armor belonged to the man who reached the 99th floor, and if he obtained all the equipment, it would return to its original power. When Nick read the information about the 99th floor, he was very surprised by it. Taking out the newly found stone, he again read that this stone was made by a man who climbed to the 92nd floor. But the armor he had just purchased was impressive, for it belonged to a man who had risen even higher. Delighted with his useful ability, Nick set out to collect all of Felon's equipment. An hour later, Nick was very upset because he diligently searched for the rest of the equipment but did not find it. However, despite this, he was able to buy a good sword and a helmet in the form of a necklace, and also some useful potions and elixirs. But since Nick wasn't finished learning about the store, he wanted to get powers and modifications. After notifications that Geek had completed training on all system requirements, the modification process began. Suddenly, the guy's clothes tore because they no longer fit him, and a fire appeared in the area. Once the modification process was completed, Nick began to look over his improved body with delight. Suddenly, notifications arrived that Nick would be given a random box with an ability, but the guy was surprised that it would appear from his bag. Suddenly, all the hidden parts that Nick had been putting together rose into the air as the boy looked at them in surprise. When they merged together, a small capsule was formed. And then that capsule turned into a box, and Nick received a notification that the level of the box with the guy's powers had increased to the highest. Because it was the first time someone had received such a box, Nick was given points as a reward, and the guy was surprised by this. When Nick got the ability to combine other different abilities from the box, our hero was absolutely delighted. Nick happily grabbed the frog and hugged it, saying that these were S-level powers. But when notifications came that for the first time in the entire server, Nick had received 2 types of powers, which was impossible. The guy went a little quiet. Suddenly, Darren's eyes lit up, and a notification came out saying that Darren had warned about the interference of chaos energy. Afterwards, a notification appeared about the emergence of a hidden path, which immediately attracted the guy's attention. But Darren looked displeased. When Nick saw the table with the gold coins he had left, he looked a little sad. However, after a dozen notifications that Nick's coins had increased, the table eventually showed that he had an infinite number of coins. Hearing that the coins were endless, the guy froze in surprise, and the frog was no longer in his hands. But after the surprise passed, the boy was overcome with joy, because now this meant that he would go all the way. However, he suddenly realized that in order to get out of the tower, he had to either spend the coins or capture the tower. The next moment, he grabbed his head in alarm at the thought that he would not be able to leave the tower. Realizing that he absolutely had to reach the 100th floor, our hero fell into a kind of despair. Suddenly, he remembered that it had taken Hans a year and 8 months to climb 61 floors. But since time was passing in the tower, it meant that 10 years would pass outside before Nick could leave the tower. Meanwhile, on the 6th floor, discontent arose due to some inspections. Out of anger, one warrior grabbed the guy who was stopping everyone and angrily asked if he was joking. And watching all this was the guy who sat in his chair and was the killer with red eyes. Jack was responsible for peace and safety. Because Jack showed everyone his knife, The warrior immediately calmed down and began to leave because he was very afraid of the consequences. Looking at his papers with information, Jack tried to figure out who that beautiful princess was. However, after thinking a little more, something suddenly caught the guy's eye. When he waved his hand slightly, two people immediately approached him and asked if he had called them. Looking at them with his red eyes, he demanded that the man who wrote the fourth report be brought to him. Almost immediately, they brought a guy to Jack who looked very scared when he saw Jack. As soon as he asked what was the matter, the brunette with glasses was pushed from behind, and Jack, swinging his leg, hit the guy's leg with all his strength, breaking the limb. The blow was so strong that the leg was almost torn off below the knee, and the boy's screams immediately began to echo through the street. Jack immediately grabbed the poor guy by the hair while he was crying in pain. Sitting down next to the guy and taking out his knife, Jack calmly asked if the guy knew what he had done. Slamming the guy's head into the ground, Jack said that he had neglected the order to check people without a guild, which is why the unknown person had entered the square without permission. Jack immediately added that perhaps this unknown person was the one the people from the guild were looking for. And in the end, Jack added angrily that because of this guy's oversight, they could no longer track down the unknown person. Rising to his feet and wiping his hands, Jack said that the boys should be grateful to be alive. Turning to the rest of the soldiers, Jack said that they needed to block all the portals and find the man who introduced himself as John. As soon as Jack said to carry out his order, all the soldiers instantly ran in different directions. Having had a good rest, our heroes yawned loudly after sleep. Stretching out on a chair, Nick said contentedly that after a hearty lunch the tension had disappeared, and Darren confirmed this. Poking the frog in the stomach with his finger, the boy told Darren that he really was a glutton. Suddenly, Nick heard disgruntled voices saying that the portals were now closed, but people from large guilds were being released just like that. Nick was very surprised to hear that the portals were blocked. Having climbed the tree, our hero said that all the portals were indeed closed. Arriving at the last fifth portal, Nick saw that there was a crowd of guards and people who wanted to pass around it. Nick suddenly thought that there was little security here, and perhaps it would be worth breaking through by force, but he was unaware of his abilities. Nick also realized that he had never fought with several people before. Having weighed all the possible consequences, Nick decided that all he could do was wait. But suddenly an explosion was heard somewhere in the city. Surprised, Nick turned around sharply, not understanding what the sound was or what the reason was. People indignantly asked if the soldiers really thought that because they were from a large guild, they could say such things. Jack then replied that provocative actions and refusal to cooperate were punishable. The soldiers immediately bowed politely to the manager, while Jack smugly waved his sword. At the sight of Jack, all the people immediately began to gradually disperse. Yawning with boredom, Jack wondered where the man named John was. Suddenly, one soldier said that an order had come from the 10th floor. If John, who was hiding under the nickname of a beautiful princess, had risen higher, then he must be caught. Jack immediately gave orders to all people to check those people who were not members of the guild and block the square. With a cold look, the guy said that if he fired a flare, the waiting group should have assembled in a couple of minutes. Just as Jack was about to tell everyone to follow the order, suddenly an explosion was heard again from somewhere far away. Jack turned around quickly and immediately thought that John might be there. It turns out that the smoke from the explosion was coming from the edge of the 6th floor. Jack twirled his sword with excitement and was glad to finally meet John. When the notification that Nick had met the killer appeared, the guy became a little tense. However, the next moment Jack appeared right in front of Nick and was getting ready to hit the guy. Unable to dodge the attack, Nick had to take the blow with his face, which was covered by a helmet. The strong blow threw the guy back and raised a lot of dust into the air after the fall. But approaching the guy, Jack said that in order to find out the identity of John or the beautiful princess, it was necessary to first kill the guy. Thanks to his ability, Nick was able to find out that Jack was the manager of the 6th floor and was a good killer. Thinking that the blow had been painful, Nick asked what Jack meant when he said that it didn't matter who exactly Nick was. Jack spread his arms wide and explained that if John was a beautiful princess, then if he died, the walkthroughs would not be published. That is, it made no difference. Pointing his finger at the square, Jack said that John looked much more like a princess than the freak who had caused the noise in the square. When Jack said that the man behind the princess's nickname had carefully concealed his identity, Nick was surprised by his opponent's intelligence. Reaching out for his sword and drawing it, Nick thought about showing Jack what would happen if he treated people's lives like that. But before Nick could attack, Jack suddenly fired a flare that lit up the sky with a bright flame. At that moment, Jack said that he used a signal flare and that the guild members would come soon, and until then, they would play together. Angrily, Nick said that Jack had simply used a missile that cost more than his cheap armor. Having said that Jack was lucky to be rich, Nick rushed at his opponent. Our hero struck, but Jack was experienced enough to immediately parry it. Afterwards, Jack also wanted to hit Nick, but our hero prepared himself and held his sword under the blow. But it turned out that instead of striking with a dagger, Jack delivered a single kick, from which Nick was unable to defend himself. Despite the difference in strength, Jack was very pleased with his blow to his opponent. But to his surprise, Nick was able to stay on his feet after taking the blow and not lose his balance. The guy asked with a grin if Jack really thought he would fall for such a trick. Hearing this, Jack immediately began to look serious, although before that he had looked down on Nick. Immediately after this, they began to fight even more fiercely, constantly attacking and blocking each other's attacks. Nick jumped up, raised his hands, and raised his sword to strike. When he lowered his sword and struck, Jack managed to put up a protective shield before doing so. Seeing the notification about the creation of a protective screen of magical power, the guy was a little surprised. Jack then mockingly asked if Nick thought such a weak attack could do any damage. Having created a huge shield, Nick said that a level D shield could easily be broken by a level B ability. When the smoke from the explosion cleared, it turned out that Jack had been injured by the blast and there was smoke coming from the guy. Then Jack became angry that he was rebuffed by someone who had recently graduated and said that John, not knowing his place, was asking for it. Realizing that the atmosphere had become tense, Nick silently held his sword in front of him. Before he could notice, Jack had quickly passed behind him, looking very furious. Our hero also didn't notice how Jack swung and struck again. The attack was so strong that Nick was unable to stay on his feet and rolled backwards, leaving a mark on the ground. Having crashed into a tree, the guy immediately leaned forward in pain and grabbed his side with one hand. Looking at Jack, he wondered if the guy had a hidden power because the damage had become stronger. But the reason for this was the brooch, which gave a boost once a day for 10 minutes. Having learned about the artifact, Nick was outraged that the guild had given a powerful artifact only to the manager of the 6th floor. Realizing the danger he was in, the boy wondered if he would lose a leg or an arm if he fought Jack. But suddenly he looked at his pet and said that he trusted Darren, who for some reason jumped into the guy's clothes. At that moment, Jack pounced on our hero, saying that he would beat him like a dog. Jack was able to move behind his opponent in an instant, and Nick didn't even notice. The next moment, a rain of blows fell on Nick, causing him to involuntarily drop his sword from his hand and cover himself with his hands. Because of his superiority over his opponent, Jack was again happy and constantly grinning. But in an instant, his face lost its passion and twisted in surprise. It turned out that in the heat of battle, Nick was able to catch Jack's leg, and he grinned at himself, pleased with himself. At that moment, Jack felt himself being pulled forward, and he could not resist it because he lost his balance. However, to his surprise, his opponent hugged him tightly. Confused by this incomprehensible move, Jack asked the guy what he was doing. Then Nick looked at his enemy and said with a grin that he noticed that Jack loved firecrackers. At first, Jack didn't understand what was going on, but the next moment he felt a strong warmth as Nick began to use the firebomb skill. There was a huge explosion immediately, leaving behind smoke, and the soldiers were worried about the manager. Having received serious injuries, Jack could only discontentedly call his opponent a freak. When Jack asked the guy if he wanted to die together, Nick happily said that he didn't want to die. Nick said that only Jack would die, and this was because Darren, who was under the guy's clothes, was treating him. And then the guy with a creepy grin and voice asked if they would continue what they had started. Then another explosion occurred, no less powerful than the first explosion. The light from it was so bright that the observing soldiers had to cover their eyes with their hands. But as soon as the explosion died down, they opened their eyes. And this happened in a circle many times. This continued until Nick finally dealt with the killer and received a reward for it. When Jack was already dead, Nick saw a notification that he would be given one random killer skill. The watching soldiers standing behind suddenly wondered what the boy was doing. It turned out that after Jack's death, Nick also decided to take 2 artifacts from him. Turning to the soldiers, Nick said with a grin, pointing to one artifact, that it was now his. Afterwards, Nick calmly walked towards the portal, and no one dared to stop him. As soon as Nick reached the 7th floor, he sat down and exhaled tiredly because he almost died. Looking at the 2 artifacts he had obtained, the guy still said with a smile that it had been a useful duel. Now our hero had 3 artifacts at his disposal, one of which he had acquired earlier. But while the guy was quite fixated on the objects, Darren croaked discontentedly. Then Nick admitted that without the help of Darren, who constantly treated the guy, he would not have been able to win the fight. Realizing how important the pet's help was, Nick smiled and joyfully patted him on the head, thanking Darren. However, even after a gentle pat on the head, the frog continued to express dissatisfaction. Nick immediately guessed that the reason was that you can't put a thank you in your pocket. That's why he decided to get lunch, which had a lot of meat, and it also improves regeneration. After saying it was only worth 300 points, Nick asked Darren if he liked it, who was already very pleased. After some time, Jack woke up, getting out of bed in alarm. The guy immediately remembered how exactly he lost to his opponent. Scratching his head, the boy thought with annoyance that one skill had also been taken away from him. Remembering the image of John, Jack thought that he would definitely find the guy and kill him. At that very moment, the guy whom Jack had beaten up earlier came into the room. Seeing the new arrival, Jack said without hesitation that from today he was leaving his position as manager. Getting out of bed and getting dressed, Jack said that he would hand over the responsibilities to the guy so he should follow him and study. But first it was necessary to sort out the mess in the square. Approaching the guy, he asked if they had caught the one who was causing chaos in the square, but Jack had yet to find out about that. Later, Jack was brought to the square and he couldn't hold back his verbal abuse while the other guys stood tensely behind him. It turned out that the man could not be stopped. So the portal was broken through and everything in the area was destroyed. Entering the battle, Nick immediately tried out his new skill, Threat. In an instant, all the goblins in front of the guy were paralyzed for a while. However, this was enough to deal with each of them and fulfill the floor's conditions of killing 10 goblins. Looking back, the guy thought with a grin that Jack's ability had proven very useful and had helped him quickly deal with his enemies. However, Nick thought that it would be better if he received kicks or a shield, and then he thought about whether he should go straight to the 8th floor. But Nick thought about the fact that there was a development area from the 7th to the 9th floor, so maybe there was something else in that place. Closing his eyes, the boy concentrated and noticed the approaching enemies. Turning around, he immediately struck, saying that he would continue to kill them. Having killed another 30 goblins, the boy tiredly leaned on his sword stuck into the ground and tried to rest. When he received a notification that a beginner's kit was being awarded, the guy was surprised. But when the notification disappeared, only a small pill appeared in the air. She immediately fell to the ground, so Nick had to pick her up, wondering what it was. But Nick was very surprised when he learned that after use the indicators increased. Popping the pill in his mouth, a satisfied Nick said he now understood why this area was for development. Once the use was completed, Nick immediately felt the effect and was delighted. But suddenly the guy realized that he needed to hunt to raise his stats, and the monsters he had killed before didn't count. Nick instantly became more cheerful at the thought that he would become very strong if he killed 100 monsters. Because Nick was too fierce an opponent, the goblins only ran away from him. However, they were not strong enough to avoid the fire the boy was creating. At that moment, it turned out to be Nick's 125th killed goblin. Only when Nick saw the notification that he had reached the limit of his indicators for the moment did the guy calm down. Looking down at his pet, Nick praised Darren for a job well done. Nick said he wanted to rest, but suddenly a notification appeared about a unique quest that required him to defeat a boss monster. But Nick was a little upset that he couldn't see the unique information about this quest, even if he used his vision. Jumping up the tree, the guy said that his powers were not infinite and now he himself would have to look for the boss. Then the guy thought about the fact that there were only goblins in the arena, so the boss must also be a goblin. At that moment, Nick remembered all the types of goblins he knew that were stronger than the standard ones. The guy immediately ruled out one goblin, but he thought about the other 2 that he could easily notice them, since those species form a cluster of goblins. The conclusion was reached very quickly due to the information known to Nick. Very quickly, our hero realized that the boss in these circumstances was a goblin with jewels. Nick knew very well that the goblin with the jewels was a coward and was very interested in the jewels. He then began to think about how to catch the goblin, while Darren noticed a butterfly fluttering nearby, but he immediately looked away from her when he felt a warm hand on his head. Leaning towards Darren, Nick said eerily that it was time to earn his keep. Suddenly, from the outskirts of the arena, the goblin smelled a familiar scent. Looking at the exit of the cave, the goblin thought that there was a scent of jewels outside it. But he also smelled the blood of his other brothers, so he didn't understand what he should do. But after a short thought, he cheerfully rushed forward because he believed that he must definitely follow the smell of jewels. While moving through the forest, he could navigate very quickly by smell. And finally, he managed to find a golden statue in the middle of the forest. Seeing the golden figurine of a frog, he was very happy with the find. Meanwhile, Nick, sitting on a tree branch, was watching Darren from above. Playing the statue, Darren turned to look at his friend. Nick smiled and told him at that moment that he didn't have much longer to stand. At the same moment, some rustling was heard from the bushes nearby. While the goblin was trying to find the unknown jewel, Nick had already noticed the enemy. As soon as the goblin's gaze fell on the statuette, he was immediately surprised. Seeing the frog, the goblin was very happy with his find. And then the goblin's body changed its shape because the interest in the jewels gave him superior strength. As Nick prepared to attack, he was simultaneously delighted to see the goblin growing stronger to level 4. As he prepared to attack, Nick said that if everything went according to plan, he would be able to catch the goblin. Meanwhile, the goblin, overcome by a passion for jewels, greedily rushed towards the figure. However, at that same moment, Nick directed a fiery blast at the goblin, which separated the goblin from the frog. As soon as Nick gave the command to cancel the golden coloring, Darren returned to his original coloring. Having returned to its original form, the frog tried to throw the object out of its mouth. And when Darren started jumping onto the tree, the goblin immediately noticed these movements. Seeing that it was no longer the golden frog that was running away, he was perplexed. As Darren was jumping towards Nick, Nick jumped out of the tree. And when the friends were finally reunited, Nick happily said that Darren had done a good job. But while the friends were joyfully reunited, the goblin wasted no time and attacked our heroes. The goblin was about to strike, and Nick gave the command to put the secret jewel back into the inventory. As soon as the jewel disappeared, the goblin immediately began to become exhausted. Afraid of taking serious damage, Nick closed his eyes and turned away slightly. But when he received the blow, the goblin was completely exhausted, so our hero did not take any damage. While the goblin did not understand how this happened, Nick had already reacted and quickly decided to attack the goblin. Calling the goblin petty, Nick hit him on the head with the hilt of his sword, intending to knock him out. Once the quest was completed, Nick was given glasses, which made him very happy. The guy crouched down and wanted to open the goblin's bag of treasure while the other goblins hid in the caves after killing the boss. As Nick reached into the bag, he said that the thing itself was cool, but the contents were more important. And as a result, our hero received a skill book, a power-up cube, a soul stone, and a piece of the ruins key. After reading that the die gave a boost, Nick assumed it was related to gambling, but since there was no penalty, everything should be fine. After looking at the soul stone, the guy's vision gave him nothing about this thing, just like the description of the item. But what interested Nick most was the piece of the key to the ruins, because the ruins could be opened under special conditions, or if one had the right to do so. Realizing that the key could only be obtained from the development site, Jack realized that different parts of the key were located on 3 floors. Then he lay down on the ground and said that he would find out about it when he rose higher. But for now, he needed to rest. After checking the community posts, Nick was surprised that the reaction to the white pellet was not so good. Then he thought that the pellet erased memory, but allowed many to survive. So was it worth not loving it? But suddenly, Nick noticed that the man with the nickname Bald Head left a piece of advice. After reading the man's confession that he had caused a ruckus in the main square and opened a portal, Nick considered him a madman. But then Nick also saw a message from that guy about there being a recruitment drive on the 7th floor. Realizing that no one would believe the superficial writing, our hero reached out. Getting ready to write the post, Nick asked the Bald Head to leave everything to him. On the 8th floor, our hero had to deal with 10 orcs. Looking down at them, the guy slowly began to draw his sword and greeted the monsters. Soon after, he began to attack and cut one goblin. The blow was so strong that it immediately killed the monster and split it into 2 parts. Having killed several orcs, Nick immediately concluded that he could easily deal with even 100 orcs. But when he heard a loud roar behind him, he immediately turned around. Then he saw that behind him stood a huge orc who had a terrifying appearance. For some reason, the orc didn't start attacking the guy and only touched his glove on his hand with his hand. At that moment, both Nick and Darren were surprised and did not understand what was happening. And the next moment, an orc's glove flew into our hero's face, which he took off. Frozen in place, Nick did not understand what was happening and how he should react to all of this. As the glove fell to the ground, he turned his gaze to it, and then a notification came out that the orc had challenged the guy to a duel. But almost immediately, the time for an answer expired and the fight began. But this made Nick feel very strange. As soon as the duel began, a light immediately lit up the orc's eyes, and the guy was perplexed and confused. The next moment, a mini arena was created, which protected the fighters from all other orcs. Finding himself in the middle of the arena, Nick was surprised that there was an orc championship. When the orc opposite him suddenly began to show different poses, Nick was surprised that the monster was showing off his muscles. Nick raised his sword in front of him and called the orc disgusting, and Darren agreed with him. The next moment, our hero used his acceleration skill and pounced on the defenseless enemy. Seeing that the enemy had attacked him with a sword, Oru managed to call the guy a vile coward. The next moment, Nick attacked with his sword, and the orc did not understand how the enemy could attack while posing. After the orc died, Nick immediately received 500 points as a reward for the fight. Stretching his shoulder, our hero was surprised at how easy the victory had been. Suddenly, the guy noticed an object that was visible from behind the clothes of the dead orc. He developed a strong interest in the unknown object, so he picked up the pendant with gold medals. Upon examining them, he learned that they were a medal of the Molar tribe, and that this mark proved that the owner was a warrior. Deciding that it would be better to sell such a trinket, Nick put several medals in his bag. However, the next moment he saw notifications about an offer to take part in the Orc Championship and challenge the tribal leader. At that moment, Nick was surprised that he thought it was a trinket, but it turned out that the ownership rights to the medals had passed to him. Immediately after this, a notification came that due to the appearance of a strong man, warriors from every clan were being summoned. Suddenly, a strong wind rose around Nick and blurry green figures appeared. Due to the strong wind that arose, our hero had to close his eyes, which is why he did not see what was happening in front of him. When Nick finally opened his eyes, he saw several strong orcs posing in front of him. Suddenly, a notification appeared that the warriors of each clan were excited due to the appearance of a strong man, and Nick thought it was crazy. Unsure how to react and feeling embarrassed, Nick told the orcs not to look at him like that. But turning back, he saw that there were orcs there too, and their numbers were only increasing. The next moment, they all started posing, and Nick was perplexed by the fact that the orcs were only becoming more and more numerous. Suddenly, all the orcs stood next to the guy and began to stare at him, and the next moment, each of them reached for his glove, intending to take it off. This was not the first time this had happened, so Nick knew what would happen next and tensed up. And the next moment, our hero was pelted with gloves from head to toe. Everyone was challenging Nick. A little angry, Nick said that they should all attack him at once. Suddenly, a smoke curtain appeared and the orcs tensed up, some of them even taking out their weapons. Very quickly, the view became limited, so one of the orcs extended his hand forward, wanting to at least feel something. However, he did not notice how the enemy approached him from behind and plunged his sword into his back. When that orc fell to the ground, the others were surprised and outraged. However, they all immediately became angry and attacked the guy in a crowd, intending to crush him with numbers. This only amused our hero, and preparing to attack them, he only tried to provoke the enemies. The next moment, our hero used a threat skill which immobilized all the orcs. Nick then used the boost and took the upgrade cube in his free hand. Then our hero received a burst of damage from the dice, so he attacked the orcs with even greater force. It took him only a few moments for the last of all the orcs to fall to the ground. Afterwards, he exhaled heavily and rose above the corpses of his defeated enemies as reward notifications came to him. Afterwards, he put his hand into the bag, putting the orc's item he had found inside. Still inside the arena, Nick noticed notifications that he was now a great warrior, having won the championship. But when he was offered the right to challenge the tribal leader, Nick was surprised and was in no hurry to make a choice. He immediately became indignant at the fact that he had previously fought to the death and had just won, and clearly did not want to get into a fight again. But after seeing the notice that if he refused he would lose the right to challenge, the guy immediately hesitated. As soon as Nick issued the challenge, he was transported to another square where the great leader of the orcs was located. Dalcinos was a great leader of the tribe, and he was the boss monster of the third floor, and also had a good tenacity skill. Outraged that the orc was simply sleeping, Nick reached for his sword and was ready to draw it. With his arms crossed over his chest and his head slightly lowered, the tribal leader slept peacefully in his place. Deciding that this was a good moment to attack, Nick snuck up behind him and tried to hit the enemy from a blind spot. The next moment, a huge explosion occurred, with which Nick intended to destroy the enemy. With a smirk on his face, the boy asked if he had been able to destroy the enemy. But Darren noticed something strange. The next moment, a shadow appeared over the guy. Surprise was reflected in his eyes, and Darren looked very worried and scared. It turned out that even after the attack, the leader continued to be in his place, but was frozen in one position after the chair collapsed. While Nick was enjoying the fact that the orc was sitting on an invisible chair, the enemy opened his eyes and looked at the guy. Rising from his seat, the orc said in his native language that it was not an invisible chair. As the orc stood up and began to approach, our hero immediately held his sword out in front of him and prepared to attack. However, the next moment a strong wind arose as the orc suddenly began to do squats. Nick and Darren looked at their opponent with great surprise, and the orc looked at them with seriousness. For some time, the opponents stood opposite each other and simply looked into each other's eyes. However, Nick was very surprised when the orc suddenly began to turn his back to him. Lifting a homemade dumbbell, the orc said that today was his leg exercise day. But suddenly, instead of starting to do the exercises, he squeezed one end with his hand and began to break it. Having crushed the stone, the orc said that because the boy had interfered with him, it was already too late. Raising a powerful battle axe, the orc said that Nick must atone for his guilt. As the orc abruptly donned his battle armor and his entire appearance radiated rage, Nick saw a notification that the battle had begun. Suddenly, a deafening roar from an orc warrior was heard, temporarily paralyzing our hero. Taking a defensive stance, our hero asked again if the orc meant that he didn't think about all sorts of nonsense. And immediately after, he used acceleration, which caused him to begin approaching his opponent with lightning speed. Nick quickly ran past the orc and struck him with his sword. At that moment, he turned around, wanting to know if he had been able to deal with his opponent. However, something was rapidly approaching him. It turned out the orc was attacking with an axe, but Nick was quick enough to turn around and put his sword in front of the blow. But even so, the orc's attack was too strong, so Nick fell, raising a lot of dust into the air. While our hero was coughing, the orc's silhouette was visible from behind the cloud of dust. Then Nick immediately realized that this opponent was much stronger compared to those he had met before. The orc didn't give the guy time to rest and immediately attacked Nick again, swinging his huge axe. Raising his axe, the orc brought it down with terrible force, destroying the entire earth with the impact. But it turned out that Nick did not get hit and managed to step aside, and then intended to attack. Taking advantage of the element of surprise, the boy attacked the monster from the side with a firebomb. Our hero was delighted with the power of the level B bomb, but at that moment Darren noticed something was wrong. It turned out that the orc was able to withstand the powerful explosion and immediately attacked Nick, who was thrown back many meters. Lying on the ground after the blow, Nick said with annoyance that the orc did not receive any damage even from the bomb. But after looking at the enemy, the guy immediately realized that when receiving fatal damage, the abilities became stronger. Almost immediately, the orc's wounds healed, and he began to pursue Nick, who ran away, thinking that giving such an ability to the boss was a scam. Roaring loudly without taking his eyes off his target, the orc intended to strike again. Almost immediately, his axe reached the ground, but Nick was lucky enough to avoid the axe. Crawling back a little, our hero continued to sit in place, and the orc looked at him, in no hurry to approach. Having decided that since attacks weren't working, he needed to change tactics, so Nick wanted to use the threat skill. But when this happened, the orc was a little surprised. Looking around, he couldn't see anything because of the smokescreen created by Nick. The orc gripped the axe tighter and began swinging it furiously, trying to clear the smoke. Nick hid behind cover and was surprised that the orc had lifted his paralysis and cleared the smoke on his own, and was now searching for our hero. The boy angrily reasoned that his best firebomb skill was an opportunity for the enemy to improve. He was trying to figure out what other way to deal with the enemy, when suddenly he saw a hint that the bodybuilder's weak spot is their back. Continuing to stare, not understanding what to do with this clue, while the orc was furiously attacking everything in the area, wanting to find the guy, Nick believed that the back was unattainable. Darren suddenly intervened and told Nick to use his abilities. Then Nick realized that if he could merge the two abilities and get a new one, then he would be able to find a way out. After looking through the possible options, Nick was surprised that his vision ability suggested merging certain abilities. But while Nick was rejoicing over the fact that he seemed to have found a way to solve the problem, the orc also found the guy and snuck up from behind. At the last moment, our hero sensed something was wrong and quickly turned back. However, he did not have time to react and avoid the blow of the axe, which split the guy's body in half. Splitting into two parts, Nick's body suddenly lost its usual shape. It was so unusual that the orc was surprised by it too. And then Nick quickly moved to the side, gradually regaining his usual appearance. Now our hero had the ability of fog acceleration. Nick could accelerate by turning into fog. But without wasting time, the orc decided to attack the guy again. At the moment when the cold weapon almost reached the guy, there was not a drop of worry on Nick's face. Smoke formed around the orc again, which surprised him again. The next moment, Nick appeared behind the orc and had already prepared his sword to strike him in the back. After Nick plunged his sword into the orc's back, he hung there, holding onto the sword. Turning around sharply, the orc cried out, asking what the guy was doing. Then the orc tried to reach his back with his hands, but he really couldn't do it. This happened for the first time, so the orc was also very surprised by such an unexpected event. Using the brooch's boost, Nick swung and remarked that the orc seemed to really like swinging. Nick immediately used the weight bracelet and was able to control his weight, wanting to make the orc do squats with the weight. Starting to hit him in the back many times, Nick told the orc that during squats he should not slouch and should straighten his back. However, the moment the orc took too much damage, his resilience skill activated again. However, Nick's eyes showed confidence in his victory, and he was going to continue attacking. Having said that the orc's ability was very unusual, Nick pierced the orc's skin and stuck his hand inside. Then he asked with a grin if the orc could survive if he was fried from the inside. And the next moment there was a huge explosion that tore the orc apart from the inside. When the orc had no strength to continue the fight, he fell to the ground, and Nick rose above him. At that moment, Nick sighed heavily from fatigue, and he received notifications that he had dealt with the leader. And then he raised both his hands up, and closing his eyes tightly, joyfully shouted that he had won. Returning to the arena, Nick fell under a tree and was surprised that the third-level monster was so strong. At that moment, a notification came out that the guy would be given a reward, and Nick saw two sources of light in front of him. It turns out that Nick was given another piece of the key to the ruins, and then he became convinced that the key appeared after defeating the boss. While putting the new part of the key into the bag, the boy wondered what would happen if he connected this part to the first one. At that moment, the two parts connected with each other and together they began to look more like a key. Jack grinned and said that he didn't know where those ruins were, but he intended to find them. But at that moment, he remembered that there was still one more reward left for him. And at that moment, he suddenly saw a strange object in front of him, which caused Nick confusion. The item fell onto the guy and immediately stuck to his face, forcing Nick to peel it off his forehead. After examining the object, Nick soon realized that it was a concentrated clot of the great leader of the tribe, which contained the power of the main orc. As Nick continued to study the subject, he began to wonder if this miracle cure was actually more than just poop. The miracle cure that Nick knew was a precious treasure, because it was the only way to become stronger. Nick remembered the hunter who used a similar remedy and immediately rose to level S. Continuing to look at the object in his hand, the boy realized that this remedy was not so powerful. However, he decided that it would be useful, and to Darren's surprise, he stuffed it into his mouth. Nick blinked, feeling sick, and thought that if this was to make him stronger, he could bear it. But immediately, the power of the great orc began to be absorbed, and Nick's expenditure of physical strength decreased. Nick turned around excitedly to look at his pet and asked how Darren was feeling. Nick smiled, showed his dirty mouth, and asked if he looked strong now. But instead of approving, Darren began to slap Nick in the face and croak in displeasure. Nick asked why he was beaten, and Darren started to explain something to him and covered his mouth with his paw. Soon after, Nick washed his face and admitted that he really did smell terrible. While the guy was taking a shower, he set an alarm, which did not go off because no one approached him. Wiping his head, Nick thought that selling the defeated orc's weapon and buying useful abilities with those points was a good decision. Soon, our heroes formed a camp, and Nick was still happy with the opportunity to buy useful things while he had points. Having handed the purchased food to the frog, Nick offered to eat, and Darren was already delighted. As Nick began to eat, he thought about what he needed to write about completing the floor. Having written down his childhood grievances, Nick was glad that it was now easier to write the text, since he was used to pretending to be a child. Because Nick was working hard to complete the game, he was curious to see how many points he had left until the next reward. But when Nick saw the notification that he only had 89 points, he was surprised because he thought that he would rise faster. Continuing to sit in the community, Nick calmly said that if he continued to post, he would receive the next reward. After reading the message that the guild on the 6th floor had been destroyed again, Nick said that the area was no longer blocked off. However, Nick was surprised that they decided to destroy the guild without any particular reason. But Nick was even more surprised when he suggested that one user wanted to measure his strength with Jack. After reading the discussions about Jack leaving his position and moving up the floors, Nick became tense and thoughtful. Remembering Jack, Nick realized that most likely this guy wanted to catch Nick. Realizing that they would most likely meet at a time when Jack was much stronger, Nick rose from his seat. Armed with his sword, Nick wanted to go and kill more orcs, reaching 100 kills. There were goblins on the 7th floor and one was trying to escape. The goblin was very frightened by his rival, who was furiously pursuing him. Taking aim, Jack threw his dagger at the goblin. He was accurate and experienced enough that he easily hit the target. Reaching the goblin, the boy stepped on him with his foot, causing the blood to gush out even more. At that moment, Jack was able to make his 100th kill and then he was going to move on. Taking back his dagger, Jack was even a little dissatisfied that the information from the beautiful princess was reliable. Clutching his head, the boy thought that his memories were vague, which meant that the information about the white granule was also true. Imagining the beautiful princess, Jack couldn't understand how she could have found out about the pellet and why she was telling everyone about it. Remembering one person, Jack wondered if he could surpass someone who had been different from birth and was able to climb to the 39th floor. But the boy's thoughts were interrupted when he saw a notice about recruiting a beginner. Then Jack realized that he could become stronger and could also rise higher. But he was a little upset when he remembered that John had taken some important artifacts from him. But despite this, Jack was determined and intended to climb up. Soon, Nick was able to achieve his goal. He killed exactly 100 orcs. Having raised all the indicators to the maximum, Nick realized that he needed to go to the next floor. But he knew that that floor would most likely be very difficult, so it was worth rechecking the artifacts. At that time, Nick already had a mystical gem, a luminescent stone, and a piece of the key to the High Alton ruins. Having climbed to the next floor, Nick had to deal with the horned wolves. It was known that these wolves did not spit poisonous saliva like goblins, and did not use weapons like orcs. As Nick walked through the dense thicket, he thought that he should be more careful. But at that moment, he looked down and saw something approaching him. At the last moment, he managed to grab and stop the horn before it could pierce his skull. Looking closer, Nick saw that he had managed to stop the wolf's horn. Nick immediately learned that their basic strength was small, and they gathered in packs and ate victims that they pierced with their horns. But the next moment, he drew his sword and pierced the wolf. Immediately after this, the entire pack appeared, which was hostile towards the guy. Suddenly, Nick remembered how he had been set up, and it reminded him of today's situation. But as soon as the wolves began to attack, Nick immediately began to defend himself from their attacks. The new wolf tried to attack the head again, but Nick anticipated this and ducked. Having cut off the wolf's head, our hero said loudly that he was now a completely different person. And then he rushed towards all the other wolves that surrounded him. They all tried to pierce the guy, but Nick jumped up and avoided being pierced by the horns. The wolves didn't scatter right away, and this allowed Nick to stand on their horns. Saying he didn't have time for these puppies, Nick used the gravity bracelet. And the next moment, he pressed the wolves to the ground with his weight and dealt with them all at once. Nick later thought about the fact that he wrote about the passage on each floor, so the guilds should determine its location. He remembered that the control had increased when he had climbed to the 6th floor, so now he needed to get up to the 10th floor quickly. And then he can tell about the passage of the 9th floor. He couldn't give up now, because after the 10th floor, there were hidden quests from NPC characters. In the heat of battle, Nick realized that if he wanted to safely reach the 10th floor, he needed to quickly get past the 9th floor. The next moment, a huge firebomb exploded in the middle of the forest. And in just one attack, Nick was able to kill 30 wolves. But suddenly Nick faced a qualification test because he had 2 pieces of the key to the ruins. When night came, Dalcin appeared, who became perfect on the 7th night. When the darkness began to approach the guy, he did not understand what it was. Suddenly night fell, and Nick had to take a luminescent stone to at least somehow illuminate the area. Looking around, Nick tried to understand where all the horned wolves had disappeared to in an instant. Due to the unclear situation, our hero began to worry greatly and suddenly heard some sound behind him. Then he decided to turn sharply there and illuminate the area. Nick was sure that someone had passed by him, and because of this, fear instantly enveloped the guy's body. The guy was about to think that he had imagined it, but there was an unknown creature behind him. Hearing someone's laughter, Nick turned back sharply again and swung his sword without aiming. This was enough to separate the monster's head from its body. However, the head immediately returned to its place and the monster laughed again. In an instant, the monster darkened and approached Nick, who was frightened. As the monster approached, Nick only stepped back in fear. However, the monster approached him, and then, like a ghost, passed through the guy. The fact that the monster passed through the body immediately made Nick think that he might have died. But later the monster disappeared, and Nick thought that the blows hadn't hurt him. Nick wanted to characterize the monster, but suddenly his strength began to leave his body. The guy fell to the ground and dropped his sword due to Dalcin sucking out his abilities. After looking at the monsters, Nick discovered that they only operated during the artificially created night and obeyed Dalcin. These monsters did not attack until they had drained some of their opponent's strength, and normal attacks had no effect on them. Having learned this information, the guy was beside himself with bewilderment. As the monsters closed in from all sides, Nick tried to understand what it meant that the seal had weakened. These monsters were taking Nick's strength, most likely in order to wake someone up, but Nick didn't yet know who exactly. Nick began to flee from the monsters, and then saw notifications that he would be given a title as a reward for completing a hidden quest. As he ran away, Nick narrowed his eyes at the thought that he definitely wanted to get that title. However, he didn't understand whether it was possible to win on this floor at all. The monsters turned out to be stronger and again passed through Nick's body, sucking out his strength. This angered Nick, so he decided to attack with a firebomb. Continuing to run through the smoke, Nick turned back, wanting to check if he had dealt with the monsters. However, at that very moment, they appeared from behind the smoke and began to laugh eerily again. Then Nick cried out that if magical abilities don't work on monsters, it's a scam. The next moment, one monster passed through the guy's leg and sucked out his abilities again. Because of this, Nick tripped and dropped the glowing ball, and Darren lost his grip on the guy. With an alarmed croak, the frog flew somewhere forward. When the frog fell to the ground, monsters immediately began to flock to it, and Nick became worried about his friend. Surrounding the defenseless frog, the monsters began to laugh. And the next moment, they all simultaneously pounced on the frog. Seeing his pet being attacked, Nick couldn't hold back his tears. Suddenly, a bright light appeared, and the monsters, frightened by it, began to run away in different directions. Seeing that Darren was able to get out of a difficult situation, Nick said that he was the best. After dealing with the frog monsters, she immediately began jumping in the other direction, ignoring Nick's question about how he managed to do it. It turned out that Darren stepped aside and spat, and his saliva was glowing. His attack immediately dealt damage to the monsters that were frightened. At that moment, Darren was very proud of himself, and 4 monsters out of the required 100 had already been killed. Suddenly, Nick assumed that the attack with a special characteristic property worked. For a moment, he thought he could attack too, but then a monster approached them. At that moment, a key appeared in Nick's hand, which he gradually collected. And then he hit the monster and was able to deal with one of them. Then Nick was glad that the sacred power was also working. However, the monsters continued to attack our heroes, so they decided to fight back together. When Darren returned to Nick, they decided to make a joint attack. After the battle, it turned out that too much of Nick's strength had been sucked out. Lying on the green grass, the boy thought that he needed a sacred weapon into which he could place sacred power. Although Nick managed to act without weapons, using only his hands, but because he only had one working hand, Nick had too many blind spots. After examining the key piece, Nick wondered if he could find something in the store that would help him upgrade the key piece into a weapon. But while Nick was resting, he didn't even notice how a horned wolf approached him. The wolf immediately attacked the guy, who was defenseless but wanted to stop the beast. To the wolf's surprise, the boy did not resist and only hugged him. Suddenly, Nick said with tears in his eyes that he missed the horned wolf very much. Starting to feel the wolf's body, Nick said that monsters must be such that they can be caught. But Nick felt the wolf's spine and squeezed it with force. When other animals saw such a massacre of the wolf, they were already afraid to approach Nick. Rejoicing that it would be much easier to deal with the wolves, Nick called them to him. However, the wolves became frightened when they saw how joyfully the boy approached them. After killing 30 wolves, night fell and Nick was able to create a homemade sacred hammer. In fact, Nick simply put the key in the bag and filled the empty space with the bag, and then simply tied it to a stick. But now he happily rushed into battle against those monsters who were a little scared at the sight of the guy. Nick ran up to one of them and immediately struck, and then it continued. Soon, he had almost 100 kills and things were moving very quickly. When it was all over, Nick said it was easy and the monster's durability was like that of the first highest level. And then the guy joyfully raised both hands up and shouted that he was able to kill everyone. Nick's second seal was also removed, but this did not bother him, because now he could even rest at night. After petting Darren, he told his pet that he had done a good job too, otherwise Nick wouldn't have known to attack with chaos. But suddenly Nick thought that if other people went up to this floor without the necessary attributes, they would definitely not cope. This thought alarmed Nick, and he immediately decided to open a community. After reading many of the messages, Nick assumed that the others must still be on the 8th floor. Realizing that someone could get to this floor before Nick left, the guy decided to share the information. Nick decided that he had already written about the important thing, about the weapon with sacred power, and he would write about the battle with the monster later. However, Nick immediately noticed a notification about someone's comment. But Nick received a friend request from Jin, who seemed to always leave good comments on Nick's playthroughs. Nick was also very happy when he saw that Nick left a comment under his post. Then Nick realized that if he published comments with reviews, his trust level would increase. But then Nick was given the title of Conqueror, which made him very happy. Now Nick could see the luck indicator, and because of this, he believed that if he accepted the friend request, something good would happen. At that moment, he said that he wanted to refuse, but he had to follow his luck. Immediately, Jin wrote something to the guy, and Nick was surprised that the answer came so quickly. Having entered the right image, Nick wrote that he felt Jin's desire to get closer. However, Nick Darren was literally sickened by this behavior. When Nick saw that Jin also knew the truth about the white granule, he was surprised. Then our hero was surprised that Jin found out the truth before him. Nick also learned from Jin that his brother was a newcomer to the Guryong Guild, but died. But before that, Jin had heard a lot from him. A lot was invested in the newcomers, because they were supposed to become the main force of the new generation. And the Guryong Guild was #1 and always boasted of its authority. But Nick didn't think it was a stroke of luck to hear so much information at once. Our hero thought there was something special about it since they shared it with him. Jin asked Nick to get something that would help him, and when the guy saw what Jin was talking about, he was surprised. At that moment, Nick had a way to get past the 13th floor. After Nick found out that Jin's brother died because of the big guilds, Jin believed that he and Nick had similar intentions. When Nick saw the statement that Jin was telling only the truth, he was surprised that the guy had money for such an expensive thing. And then Nick smiled at the thought that he could believe and use this passage. Afterwards, Nick decided to publish a walkthrough of the 13th floor to confuse the guilds and wanted to move on. On the 6th night, Nick remembered that Dalcin would appear on the 7th night, so Nick had little time to prepare. Nick had managed to improve his abilities in those days, but he wasn't sure if it would be enough. Thinking back on his past opponents, Nick began to think that more often than not, luck had simply smiled on him. Clenching his fist, Nick determined that this time he would be ready. After that, he bought several skill boxes and wanted to try combining abilities. A little later, the guy picked up the sheet, and he spread it out in front of a small table, onto which Darren immediately jumped. While the frog lay on the sheet, Nick hoped that something good would happen to him. And then, with a sparkle and hope in his eyes, the guy began to open the boxes. As soon as the first box was opened, a ray of light immediately poured out of it. And the first ability that fell out allowed the guy to pretend to be dead. Nick was immediately upset by the realization that he had received a useless ability. Then Nick told Darren to bring them luck or happiness. The second box gave Nick a killer pose, and from the third, the opportunity to curl up into a ball. After these 2 attempts, there was still no luck. Nick continued to receive useless abilities. Having fallen forward, Nick was in despair and no longer believed in the existence of luck. However, at that moment, a notification appeared about the luck that had appeared. The last 2 dropped abilities that would be useful for Nick to fuse. Saying that Nick now only trusted Darren, he began the fusion of abilities. On the 7th day, Nick counted the wolves he had killed, which was enough to complete the beginner's set. Holding his sword in front of him, Nick said that if he killed 30 wolves, an artificial night would come. Approaching the last wolf, Nick was going to kill it in order to meet the boss. Nick quickly approached the wolf and inflicted numerous cuts on it. Nick swung his sword, looked up at the sky, and thought that now everything was about to begin. The next moment, artificial night really did arrive. At the same moment, the seal of Dalcin began to be removed, but it was not completely removed. Nick watched from afar as the first two seals were removed. And then, from somewhere behind the mountain, someone's howl was heard. Soon after, someone was rapidly approaching our hero. Nick received a notification that he should be careful because the wolf Dalcin raised his body. But at that moment, darkness approached Nick from behind. It became so dark that he could not see anything at all when suddenly a source of light appeared. Using night vision, Nick was surprised to see two moons in the sky. But the next moment, Nick saw a huge beast in front of him. Not expecting Dalcin to arrive so quickly, Nick put his hand out in front of him to attack. The next moment, a firebomb exploded. However, despite the power of the attack, Dalcin did not receive any damage. As Nick prepared for battle, he was terrified to imagine how strong Dalcin would become if all the seals were removed from him. But despite this, Nick did not give up and wanted to hit the wolf with even greater force. But when he struck with his sword, the monster was able to stop him with its paw. Nick was amazed that he stopped the lightning attack with just one paw. Nick then suggested that the black fire was protecting the monster. He then gave the command to Darren, who immediately took action. He spat again towards the monster to check the damage, and from this, Nick concluded that there was an effect from attacks with special properties. After this, Nick decided to increase the distance between his opponent. As he drew his weapon, he remembered that light or sacred power was used against darkness. Therefore, Nick was determined to use his weapon to knock down Dalcin. Their battle continued with renewed vigor after that. Dalcin attacked as fiercely as Nick, but the guy tried to avoid the attacks. Nick tried to keep his distance, but the wolf kept trying to grab the guy with its paws. However, Nick continued to fight him off furiously. By attacking the wolf, he neutralized the halite with sacred power, and then he was going to thrust his sword into that very place. When Nick managed to do it, he was happy, and the wolf roared in pain. Enraged, Dalcin decided to attack even more furiously. At that moment, Nick was unable to dodge the wolf's paw, so he flew into a tree. Sitting on the ground, the guy thought it was too harsh, but Nick was at least glad that he could hold on thanks to his new fusion ability. He absorbed damage. As soon as Nick got to his feet and took the sword, Dalcin began to approach him again. And the next moment, instead of attacking, Dalcin roared. Then Nick was surprised that the wolf attacked with his breath because he was not a dragon. Shielding himself from the bright, blinding light, Nick thought he couldn't absorb that kind of damage. However, it turned out that this ability was sealed, so it could not be used. The wolf was surprised by this and a little indignant, showing his teeth. However, what was happening was only to Nick's advantage. Taking advantage of the enemy's moment of confusion, Nick rushed forward. Coming closer, he swung his weapon at the wolf. However, the monster tried to stop the attack and in doing so broke the weapon. Afterwards, he immediately pushed the guy away, who flew back. Nick was a little confused that his weapon was now broken and only his sword remained. The monster immediately continued to attack, and Nick went on the defensive. Nick soon realized that he could not defeat the wolf with just one sword. At the moment when the wolf jumped towards Nick, our hero decided to find another way out. Nick looked at Darren and asked to switch to the backup plan. Immediately after this, Nick jumped into the air, avoiding a collision with the monster. The wolf, in turn, was surprised by the guy's behavior. Looking up, the monster saw that the guy was in the air at that moment. And then Nick gave Darren the command to use the water cannon. After this, Darren spat his saliva at the monster again. Once the attack had achieved its goal, the wolf was not happy about it. As he fell down, Nick also gave Darren the command to continue. And then he landed on Dalcin's back. The dissatisfied monster immediately began to growl and show his grin, and then he started running in different directions, trying to throw the guy off of him. However, Nick had no intention of letting the wolf go. Still clinging to the wolf's back, Nick used every power-up he had. As Nick lay on the wolf's back, he felt as if his skin was being burned. However, he chuckled at the thought that his fire was hot too. And after that, he tested the firebomb on the wolf again. Nick used the bomb non-stop and created explosions. Gradually, the wolf began to take damage from her. But Nick at that moment didn't understand how he had come to the point where he himself became a demolitionist. The wolf continued to run and try to throw the guy off, but he was unsuccessful. At some point, Nick admitted that he was already feeling sick from all of this. But Nick had to endure all this just so that he could eventually use the ability. Nick had been collecting the damage he had taken all this time in order to release it. After that, Nick managed to win, but he was exhausted. Looking at his opponent, Nick wondered if it was true that only 2 of his seals had been removed. Nick wanted to say that despite the wolf's strength, he still defeated him. But Darren stopped the guy. Then they started arguing, because Nick believed that the wolf should be killed. But while they were arguing among themselves, the monster rose to its paws again. Then a notification came out that Dalcin had put his existence on the line and used part of his sealed abilities. Rising to his paws, Dalcin growled at Nick. Covering his face with his hands, Nick was surprised that the monster was putting his existence on the line for victory. But soon Nick felt that it was becoming too dangerous and something terrible was coming. Darren was very surprised when he suddenly flew to the side. Then Nick said that Darren should go for now. Taking out one artifact, Nick asked the wolf if he thought Nick wouldn't do anything. And then he tore the scroll apart, releasing a powerful flame. When the big explosion happened, Darren was far away from it and took no damage. However, Nick looked bad because Darren was no longer treating him. Because of this, Darren was very worried about his friend and was very sad that he could not help now. Approaching the frog, Nick stroked its head and was touched by the fact that Darren was still worried about him. And then Nick, smiling, reassured his pet that he would never abandon him. Turning back, Nick saw that he had now dealt with Dalcin. Delighted that Nick had achieved his goal, he also received 10 points to his scores. But immediately after that, Nick fell to the ground without strength, while Darren was worried about him. When Nick woke up, he found himself in a completely different place. Then he touched his face and realized that his entire skin was covered in drool. Looking to the side, he saw a tired Darren lying next to him. Taking the frog in his arms, Nick said that he was very sweet for trying to cure the guy for so long. But at that very moment, Nick received a reward for the quest, the last piece of the key, and was delighted. As soon as the last piece appeared, the other 2 immediately started flying towards the guy. Reunited with the final piece, the key finally returned to its original form. Now Nick was glad that he had the key, which meant he only needed to find the ruins. Nick was also given a scarf and a title that will help him improve his performance. But after joining the community, Nick saw disagreements, so he realized he should write about the walkthrough. And after that, Nick suggested sleeping to restore physical strength. Meanwhile, on the 30th floor in the Sangoon Guild, Sam was indignant at Jack's behavior. Not only was the 6th floor breached, but artifacts were also taken. Sam was tired of being picked on by his superiors because of that incident. But suddenly 2 people came to him and asked why he had called them to him. 2 people from different guilds came to Sam. When they sat down on the sofa, they immediately demanded to know why they were invited there. The girl was unhappy that some man had broken through to the 10th floor, and Sam apologized for it. The blonde suggested that the guy could be even lower than the 13th floor, but the girl said that he should break through to the floors above, because she did not want to suffer alone. Assuming that someone had told her how to get to the 13th floor, the girl assumed that the wanted man had a team. There was no information about the beautiful princess, so they could not know for sure whether there were accomplices. However, Sam said that it was very likely that the man named John was a beautiful princess. Sam asked the other guilds for help in cooperating so that Jack, who was pursuing John, could operate on the 10th floor. The most important thing for Sam was to keep the damage as minimal as possible. Looking at the girl, he asked that it was difficult to catch a beautiful princess, so it was unclear how the girl would target her accomplices. But there were also some other people with strange names, with whom they could presumably have created a team. Then the blonde man said that there were many eyewitnesses regarding one such person. Because of this, Sam decided that the best way to catch the person with the nickname Your Head is Bald. The 10th floor of the tower was a safe zone. Now Nick was in the safe zone, and looking at the community, he saw that the guys were now in the safe zone too. Reading Jean's praise, Nick didn't understand why the guy exaggerated so much. Nick was about to think that Jean was being too helpful when he suddenly saw someone approaching him. It turned out that someone had come running and accidentally knocked Nick down. Looking ahead, Nick saw a girl politely extending her hand to him. Nick immediately saw red fox ears. The girl also had a fox tail. Suddenly, Nick realized something and his whole face twisted. Meanwhile, a smiling girl asked if Nick wanted to take on a quest. Nick knew that everyone wanted to get quests, but this was not the case. But the quest given by this unusual NPC had a fatal condition. At that moment, all the other people were staring at Nick, thinking that she was targeting the newbies and this guy was out of luck. Nick thought that the bad thing now was that he was attracting too much attention and could catch the eye of the big guilds. So Nick decided to run away, but Lilka didn't want to let him go, so she prepared to run after him. And at one point, Lilka was able to catch up with the guy and asked if this was too much. Then Nick was surprised that the girl was able to catch up with him in an instant. Later, Nick stopped, unable to run any further, but Lilka was still cheerful. The girl wasn't at all tired from the chase. Nick knew that the NPCs were so strong that even guilds were wary of them. However, Nick angrily asked if it was even possible to give out such crappy quests. Of the items that needed to be delivered to the girl, one of them was a dragon scale. Nick knew that even if he got the items he needed, he would have to die at least once. That's why people said that Lilka's quest was the most dangerous, and the girl asked Nick to calm down. And afterward, she said that she had a good feeling about him and was sure that he could handle it. Continuing to smile, she suddenly asked, Lilka asked if the guy had a lot of interesting things with him. Lilka immediately noticed a scarf that many people wanted to get, as well as an interesting chainmail. But then she pointed at Darren and asked if he would sell the frog. But then the guy said with displeasure that you can't look closely at other people's animals. Lilka said that this was a very rare case, so she wanted to take the frog at a high price. Nick wanted to refuse, but he saw what kind of weapon he was being offered. This hammer was very difficult to get. There were also many other S-level artifacts. When Nick was tempted by rare and good things, Darren was unhappy about it. And in order to bring the guy to his senses, he hit him on the cheek. Then Nick said that Darren is his family, so he refuses Lilka. However, the girl said that if he changed his mind later, he should tell her. She wished him luck with the quest, and then ran off to do her own things. And when they were alone, Nick tried to convince the frog that he had not been tempted. Looking at Lilka, Nick thought about the fact that the traders did not do anything that was to their detriment, which meant Darren was very valuable. But Nick thought it didn't matter what things were offered to him. He wanted to raise Darren without regrets. But despite such thoughts, a tear rolled down the guy's cheek. Nick went up to the floor and immediately received an assignment, so now he wanted to rest. Now Nick was indignant because he wanted to complete quests that had better rewards, but now he would not be able to accept them because of Lilka's quest. But he had his sights set on something else, so he perked up a little. He needed an event at the Kildor's Hall Arena, which was run by another NPC. It was an event where hunters measured their strength. The event was held in a tournament format and was expected to offer good rewards. To be on the safe side, Nick decided to wear a mask. After that, he entered the main office and greeted everyone politely. But it turned out that the NPCs Nick needed were simply sleeping. Approaching him, Nick said that he would like to apply to participate. Hearing this, the man immediately opened his eyes and looked at the guy. But seeing a masked man in front of him, Kildoris became frightened. Because of this, he jumped out of his seat and immediately attacked the guy. Due to the danger, Nick's necklace-shaped helmet immediately activated. And after that, a huge explosion occurred in the arena building. The blow was too strong and Nick was thrown back into the wall. After this, Kildoris came almost right up to the guy, and seeing that Nick had not moved, he asked if the guy was dead. At that time, the man did not understand why a monster appeared in the safe zone. Then he realized that there couldn't be a monster here and that there was a man in front of him. Approaching the boy, Kildoris put his hands on his shoulders and said that he could not die like that. When Nick started saying something, Kildoris was glad that he hadn't killed the guy. However, Nick was surprised that just one blow knocked the guy out. After that, they returned to the office and Kildoris apologized. But with a grin, he asked why Nick confused people with this monster mask. Taking off his mask, Nick said that he shouldn't have waved his fist like that anyway. Kildoris immediately realized that Nick was hiding his identity, so he suggested registering him under the name Evil Eye. And because Kildoris had done wrong, he offered a good reward in the tournament. However, Nick asked what difference it made to him if he couldn't win first place. But then the man replied that Nick would survive this tournament because he had withstood Kildoris's blow. However, Nick countered that the man was simply trying to quickly forget about what happened. Angered, Nick said that perhaps he should file a complaint because Kildoris had been using his power inappropriately. Then Nick created a drama by saying that he had a headache and would not be able to participate in the tournament. After listening to the guy, Kildoris said that he understood him. And after that, the man decided to create a space that would isolate them from what was happening outside. Kildoris said that he would now share the secret, but because he had his own role and limitations, He could not give Nick something for free. The man said that he managed the arena, which meant he could only give a reward through a prize. He decided to add the right to advance to the final without qualifying. Nick heard that the final and the qualifying round were held on the same day, so it would be advantageous to go straight to the final. Nick thought that in this way he could keep his abilities a secret until the final. Kildores also added that an odd number of people will advance to the finals, and one will advance without selection. He will give this right to Nick. Then Nick said that he would accept such a kind offer. Our hero was very pleased with the benefit he received. Afterwards, he bowed politely to Kildores and was about to leave. However, Kildores worriedly asked the boy not to tell anyone about what had happened. But Nick turned around in bewilderment and asked if anything had happened today. Hearing this, Kildores smiled and said that they had found common ground, and later said goodbye. Afterwards, the man put his feet on the table and thought that this competition should be interesting thanks to this guy. Looking at Darren, Nick said that he had already submitted his application, so they could look for something worthwhile on the market. Nick thought he had eyes and luck, so he could find something to improve his abilities. After visiting the market, our heroes took home a bunch of different food. They only bought food, but Darren was very happy about it. But despite this, Nick managed to get hold of one dagger. The dagger was not special, but it was durable, and if you drank the owner's blood, the owner would receive a curse. The abilities of this dagger were unclear to Nick. Suddenly, Nick heard some noise in the street and saw that there was a crowd of people. He decided to go and check what had happened, while screams were coming from there that someone was trying to steal the artifacts. After observing the strange scene, Nick decided that one of those people was a pickpocket. But suddenly a commanding voice was heard, ordering everyone to disperse. Dalcin was the manager of the 10th floor, a member of the Dalcin Guild, and loved the attention. Nick felt a little tense when he unexpectedly met the manager. Approaching the guy from the Phoenix Guild, Dalcin said that he would deal with the guy who was on the ground. After that guy started to leave and the pickpocket was tense, holding out his axe to him, Dalcin ordered the man to raise his weapon. He said that if the man wins, Dalcin will turn a blind eye to what happened, but if he loses, he will lose his arm. The man immediately began to apologize and said that he would not do it again. Then all the people told the manager to kill the pickpocket because he was making excuses and it looked disgusting. Due to the crowd's attention, Dalcin's numbers suddenly began to increase. Before this, Nick hadn't understood what all the fuss was about, but now it became clear that this was how abilities were activated. While the crowd was indignant, Dalcin asked the man what he would do since everyone wanted him dead. The pickpocket only swore at the situation that had arisen. Grabbing his humble knife, he lunged at Dalcin, intent on fighting. He attacked furiously, but the manager easily avoided the attacks. This went on for a while, and Dalcin just grinned. Afterwards, he decided to go around the enemy from behind and attack, calling him slow. The crowd's shouts only gave Dalcin strength at that moment, and the next moment he made several swings with his weapon, cutting the enemy. When the fight was over, everyone was delighted with the manager. Nick thought that the enemy was too weak, so he couldn't fully analyze Dalcin, but he already had at least something. Dalcin's showiness caused him to make many ineffective moves, and to stop his power growth, he needed to fight in a place where there were no people. Then Nick decided that dealing with the manager would be easier than he thought. Afterwards, they continued on their way, heading to the hotel and wanting to rest. He thought there was nothing to see here, but suddenly he passed by a merchant. At that moment, Nick felt that his luck was telling him something. Then he took a closer look at the merchant who was sitting on the interesting object. Looking at that object, Nick didn't understand why the wind was coming from there. Suddenly, the merchant noticed the guy. Having stood up, he immediately began to praise his stall, which had the best medicines. While the merchant was telling something, the golden light continued to emanate from the same object. Suddenly, he started talking about why he didn't become a hunter and started trading. But Nick wasn't interested. After examining the potions that had the lowest levels, Nick doubted their quality. Then he suddenly pointed his finger at the glowing box and asked if there were also potions there. The man said that was true, but they were all defective. After showing all the potions, the merchant said that this was not something that could be sold for money. Looking at the counter, where there was also nothing worth selling, Nick said that he would buy what was in the box. The merchant said he could sell it, but if there was a problem later, he wouldn't be able to give me any refund. But Nick said that this wouldn't happen anyway, because it wouldn't be him who would be drinking, but Darren. The merchant gave an approximate price and asked where to put these potions, but Nick replied that he had a place to put them separately. "Give me the potions," The merchant said that although they were defective, they still had some effect. But suddenly he fell silent and stared at the guy in surprise. Not understanding what was happening, Nick also looked at the merchant. But then the man turned away abruptly and said that the weather was nice today. As Nick started to leave, he bowed and wished the boy a good journey. But as soon as Nick started to leave, a strange expression appeared on the merchant's face. Walking through the evening city, Nick thought that after his realization, his 5 senses definitely became better. Leaning down slightly, Nick asked Darren if he thought they were being followed. And in response to this, the frog croaked affirmatively. As he watched our heroes, the man thought that the guy must have been holding a bag of jewels. Peeking around the corner, the man thought he just needed to find out where Nick was staying. But continuing to follow the guy, the man suddenly lost sight of him. Looking around, the merchant did not understand where the guy could have gone. According to the merchant, the Dalcin Guild promised to hire him if he told where the man with the bag of jewels was staying. Then Nick was surprised to learn this information. Then Nick realized that he was publishing floor walkthroughs so the guilds would know that the beautiful princess could have many artifacts. Nick was angry with himself for his carelessness and didn't want to use the bag in front of people anymore. Meanwhile, the man decided to report his discovery before anyone else got there. Nick initially thought about killing the merchant, but then he heard that he wanted to give his potions to the guild. Because of this, Nick decided to deal with the man in a different way. Nick decided to take an indirect approach. Soon, the merchant reported to the manager about Nick and that he saw a bag of jewelry on him. But Dalcin asked if the man had checked where the man was staying. But then the merchant said with annoyance that the guy had disappeared, so it was not possible to check. From what he heard, Dalcin assumed that John or the beautiful princess had noticed the surveillance and therefore hid. After thinking about it, Dalcin said he would contact the man later and let him go. However, the man was in no hurry to leave. He offered his potions to the guild. Then the manager said with a smile that if that man was the one they were looking for, then they would take the merchant in. But another man asked if the manager believed it was true. Taking one potion, Dalcin said that as expected, the wanted man was on the 10th floor. Dalcin said that the man was well informed about the tower and would stay here for some time to pass the tower. However, the manager suddenly became gloomy and said to catch the one who came. Enraged, he threw the bottle at the wall and ordered that the man be found immediately. Looking at the wall where the bottle landed, the guy was surprised by the effect the potion had. Dalcin was angry that a hired killer came to them. When Nick woke up in the morning, he said that Darren had worked very hard yesterday. He had developed poison. Before this, Darren could spit acidic saliva and regenerate, but now he could also exhaust fire and poison. And thanks to this, they were able to put a spoke in the wheel of the drug merchant. Nick also managed to write about this in the community. But after that, they decided to go and complete Lilka's quests before the arena trials began. As Nick walked down the street, he immediately heard rumors that someone had tried to kill the poison manager yesterday. Because of this, Nick concluded that he was able to teach the man a lesson. Nick decided to come to the square and watch how the merchant would be driven out. Dalcin, like last time, offered a duel. The merchant tried to say it was a conspiracy, but Dalcin decided to swing his weapon. He did not respond to requests to stop and almost cut the man in half. When a merchant died, 1 coin was removed from his account. All the spectators were delighted by this spectacle. But immediately after his death, the merchant returned to this place again. Realizing that he would be killed again, the merchant covered his head with his hands. Realizing that Dalcin was killing until the man ran out of coins, thereby driving him out of the tower, Nick decided to leave. But Nick believed that even if a person was from a large guild, he should not have such powers. Suddenly, Nick thought he felt sorry for that man. However, both Nick and Darren agreed that he must answer for his actions. There were snakes crawling on the 11th floor of the tower. But having caught up with the snake, someone plunged a sword into its head. After that snake, Nick was glad that he finally collected all the skin. Now Nick had snake skin, but he needed dragon scales. In order for a monster part to become an artifact, it was necessary to slaughter the monster for meat, treat it with an ability, or have the appropriate weapon. Nick didn't have the necessary abilities, but he still had something to take. Having found the snake, he was delighted with this find. It turns out that the snake was located near a skill book with fire resistance. Nick quickly dealt with the snake by simply cutting off its head. After that, a steel book with poison resistance also dropped. Then Nick was delighted to receive 2 useful books at once. After this, Nick would be able to have resistance to poison and fire. But while resting, Nick thought it was a passive skill, so his level would rise when he was near the fire. As Nick entered the community, he thought that the guys were still supposed to be going through the 9th floor. After reading a funny argument between some people, Nick decided to choose the one who, in his opinion, would rise to the next floor before the rest. Soon, Nick passed the 12th floor, where he had to kill mud golems and exploding lizards. Looking at the tired Darren, Nick said that he was almost finished. As Nick entered the portal that had formed, he thought that they needed to finish this as soon as possible. And then Nick found himself on the 13th floor where the volcano was located. But immediately, the guy saw a notification that he needed to survive for 8 hours. Nick immediately decided that this was too difficult. At that moment, he was attacked by a huge scorpion, which immediately lost its tail. The monster immediately roared in pain. And after that, Nick launched another attack, immediately killing the monster. But the confidence disappeared from Nick's face when he heard someone's loud footsteps. And then he saw a fiery dragon in front of him. The fire dragon was level 5 and had a systemic restriction, so if Nick wanted to survive, he had to dodge. But given the large difference in size, Nick didn't understand how he could attack the dragon. Because of this, the guy thought it would be best to hide and hold on. But Nick needed the dragon scales, so he had to attack first. Hiding behind a rock, Nick decided to peek out from behind the shelter. And then he saw that the dragon was drinking lava. The guy decided that no matter what happened, he couldn't miss such a chance. Using the acceleration, Nick immediately moved forward. However, the dragon raised its head a little and noticed the approaching threat. It turned out that Nick was aiming straight at the dragon's eye. Hoping that the attack would be successful, Nick put all his effort into it. But suddenly the guy woke up and quickly jumped out of his place. However, to Nick's surprise, he found himself in bed. Darren was a little confused by Nick's screams this morning. And the next moment, Nick became sad when he remembered that he had died. Nick thought it was a shame that the dragon had simply trampled him. Soon the guy went to that floor again, using all his artifacts. Using the firebomb, he wanted to hit the eye. However, even the dragon's skin was very durable. Nick's sword simply broke. Looking at what was left of his sword, Nick was perplexed. And then he saw the furious gaze of the dragon, who was staring at the guy. And then the dragon also decided to attack the guy. Having been revived again, Nick reasoned that the dragon had strong armor and the bomb had no effect on it. Nick was shocked that he was fully charged from just 1 foot of the dragon. But now, Nick's weapon was broken, and he didn't know what to do with it yet. This made Nick wonder where he could find a suitable weapon. But suddenly a solution to the problem came to Nick's mind. Afterwards, he moved in search of some person. As Nick walked towards the arena, he told Darren that he would pick him up quickly and ask the frog to understand him. As he walked inside, Nick greeted him politely. There he saw Lilka, who was eating dessert with Kildores. Seeing the guy, Lilka said enthusiastically that they were just talking about him. When Nick addressed Lilka directly, the girl tensed up. Reminding her that she wanted to take Darren, Nick offered to bet her a frog. Lilka was a little surprised by the request to borrow a good weapon in exchange for a frog. Then Nick said that if he exceeded the set time, he would give Darren up and return the sword. Then the girl laughed, saying that he was very impudent. She said that asking for a weapon from the one who gave the quest was absurd. Having calmed down, she asked how many people had attempted this quest. Nick sternly replied that she was giving out quests to fulfill incoming orders, but if the level of trust in her fell, she would not be able to engage in trade. Upon hearing this, Lilka immediately became alarmed. Nick confidently said that only he could complete this quest. Seeing a piece of dragon scale, Kildores immediately agreed. Not understanding what had come over him, the girl was surprised, but the man asked her to calm down and take a closer look. Nick didn't forcefully remove the scales, which aren't considered artifacts, meaning that if you give Nick a good weapon, he'll complete the quest. Then Nick asked what Lilka would decide. After thinking for a bit, the girl agreed and decided to give him a good sword. Lilka was ready to borrow this sword, but the guy shouldn't have deceived her. Nick's mouth started watering at the sight of the sword. Having decided that Nick agreed to everything, she took Darren's hand herself. However, Nick didn't even realize when the girl managed to take the frog. Lilka said that Nick was given a week, and if he brought the scales during that time, he would receive the sword. However, if he loses, the frog will go to the girl. But this is where our heroes agreed. Suddenly, he decided to ask if the sword was strong, and Lilka replied that if he wanted to break it, the sword would not give in. As he left, Nick said that as soon as he had the opportunity, he would immediately return to Darren. But suddenly, the man stopped the guy and threw something at him. It turned out that Nick had gotten his hands on a steelbook from the slaughterhouse. Kildoris said that Nick could not bring useless scales, and the dispute must be fair. And as he said goodbye, he reminded Nick that there was little time left before the start of the fighting. When Nick left, Kildoris admitted that he didn't think Nick would get the sword. He said Nick was interesting, but not to get too carried away by him. But the girl replied that she understood this too. Nick's fire resistance kept him going, but it was hard to fight. He understood that he couldn't kill the dragon, so he only had to tear off the scales. There was a scale on the dragon's neck that had to be torn off while it was drinking lava. Standing to his feet, Nick said that the time had come. At that moment, the dragon was already drinking lava and did not notice the guy. Nick took out his sword and prepared to fight. And then he quickly moved forward, preparing his sword. Nick approached a pile of stones on the ground. And then, at high speed, he pushed off from her. Once he was in the air, the guy used the power-ups he had. And then he attacked the dragon while he was unaware. Having hit the dragon, Nick decided to look back. Then he saw that the dragon tried to attack with its tail. But it turned out that Nick's sword was stuck in the dragon's neck. The force of the impact made Nick feel like he had been hit by a bus. If he hadn't changed direction with the explosion, he would have died. But as Nick had originally planned, he was able to plunge the sword into the scale. The first step was to thrust the sword. Next, apply force in the opposite direction so that the scale comes off. This time, Nick was serious about taking the scale. Seeing the guy, the dragon roared with displeasure. However, this time, Nick was not scared. Jumping up, he managed to climb onto the tail and ran along the dragon's back. And then he wanted to jump to gain height. By jumping, Nick was able to gain enough height. And immediately after, he used the gravity bracelet and used the bomb. After attacking the dragon, Nick fell off it. Having fallen to the ground, the guy rolled on it several times, and then he stood up, wanting to immediately find out what happened to the scales. But the dragon was angry, and the sword is still in the dragon's neck. Because of this, Nick immediately concluded that he was finished. Soon, explosions began to occur among the volcanoes. The dragon continued to pursue the fleeing boy. Nick turned around and saw how fast the dragon was approaching him. The dragon turned around and tried to attack with its tail. But then I saw that the guy was not at the scene of the attack. Suddenly, the dragon lost sight of the guy who was hiding behind the rock. At that moment, Nick decided that he couldn't just run away and had to finish the battle before the boost ran out. Then he came out of his hiding place and began to approach the dragon again. Trying to provoke the dragon, Nick said that this time he would definitely get its scales. Seeing the man, the dragon immediately ran furiously towards him. Coming closer, he wanted to swallow the guy, but Nick was able to dodge. At that moment, our hero used fog acceleration. Nick vanished into thin air, and the dragon clenched its teeth, failing to catch its target. As the dragon looked around, the fog thickened around his neck. In this way, Nick was able to get closer to the sword and grab it. Soon, he also regained his normal physical form. And then I decided to use some tidal. The boy called out to the night and suddenly darkness appeared. Thus, night was formed, and Nick's ability indicators increased. With all his strength, he tried to use the sword as a lever. Only at that moment did the dragon finally feel pain and roar. And after that, the protectors were summoned and attacked the dragon. However, all they were required to do was to distract the dragon's attention. Suddenly, the dragon felt even more pain and roared louder. A fire appeared around, making it more difficult to extract the scales. At that very moment, Nick could hardly move his sword. And then suddenly the sword jumped out. In desperation, Nick decided to continue removing the scales by hand. He tried with all his strength to pull out the scales. Because of the heat, Nick could no longer feel his hands, and this was truly the last resort. But suddenly Nick, intending to take the scales, decided to blow up the dragon from the inside. Using the ability, Nick unleashed a powerful strike on the dragon. Nick himself also took a lot of damage, but despite this, he managed to pull out the scales. Before Nick died, he received a notification that the quest had been completed. Meanwhile, a lot of people had already gathered in the arena wanting to watch the tournament. For guilds, this was a good opportunity to find talented people. But someone immediately noticed that half of the audience were people from guilds. But both guys agreed that they had once been noticed at a tournament, and now they were managers. Dalcin said the mood was fiery during the victory, and Simai responded that if they were fixated on the past, they would not be able to rise to the top. According to him, while they were managers of the lower floor, others had risen higher during this time. However, Dalcin was also determined to go higher. However, to do this, he had to catch a man with the nickname Your Head is Bald. While they were discussing the strange nickname, Kildoris entered the arena. Appearing before the public, he thanked everyone for waiting. Realizing that Nick had been fighting the dragon for too long, he hurried to the arena. Because of this, he even had to quickly push his way through the crowd. But Nick was told that the preliminary selection was over and the final would soon begin, and there was a waiting room on the other side. Because of this, Nick felt that he was not late. However, it turned out that Nick ended up in the arena by chance, and at that moment, Kildoris wanted to announce the final selection. When he announced its beginning, the audience was delighted. Nick was delighted and thought that he would definitely win. But before we started, we had to introduce the selection participants. There were 15 people in total, and they were divided into two groups. Nick found himself in Group B and only needed to win 2 rounds to win the tournament. But the public was unhappy with the appearance of a new person who was not present at the selection. Immediately, they started throwing food at Kildoris. He didn't like it, so he used the silence skill. At that moment, the entire arena fell silent. It turned out that there was a kind of seal on people's mouths, and they couldn't remove it and talk on their own. He sternly replied that the matter had been decided after careful consideration, so no objections were accepted. All the people, including Nick, were a little terrified at that moment. But at that very moment, the man clapped his hands and canceled the ability. Then everyone regained the ability to speak. Kildoris said it would be unfair for the boy to pass the selection without punishment. While the crowd was in awe, Nick thought it was a knife in the back. But suddenly Nick heard a message addressed to him that Kildoris would not apply a major punishment. He then confessed to the public that he would seal one of the participants' abilities. Watching this, Nick thought that Kildoris had thought this through carefully. According to Nick, a person on the 10th floor has 3 or 4 abilities, and if you seal one, then 1/3 of the strength will be lost. Nick thought that in that case, newcomers from large guilds should shy away from him. Kildoris said that due to privacy, he would only reveal the rank and name of the ability. And then they announced that it was rank E and level 4. The crowd rejoiced, but Nick only grinned. The ability to see at night had been sealed. After the competition, they were preparing to make an announcement, and the participants were supposed to enter the arena. One of the first members was a fairly well-known manager from the Eclipse Guild. It was a muscular man named Harry. Nick stood calmly, waiting for the second participant. But at one point, Nick was very surprised. In front of him was the man he had bet on and who had won. Nick was very surprised that while he was completing the quest, someone went up to the 10th floor. It turned out that this crazy guy was a man with the nickname Your Head is Bald. Nick decided it was good that this guy did not disclose his real nickname, so they could think that he was just a fan of the beautiful princess. However, it turned out that people immediately recognized the man who single-handedly attacked the Sangoon Guild. As a result, Nick decided that this guy can do whatever he wants. But opening his eyes, he calmly looked ahead. It turned out that the guy was looking at Nick. Suddenly his brows furrowed and Nick felt something was wrong. However, this weirdo simply praised Nick's mask. But then he added that Nick was strong, and this made our hero tense. Even though the guy had a strange suit, he showed good results. When the rivals met, Harry said the guy made a loud entrance. When the conversation turned to the princess, the guy asked if Harry liked her too. And then the man replied that he would like to meet her. The angry guy said that the princess had many admirers. As soon as the fight began, the guy immediately disappeared from sight. When Harry looked down, he saw that his opponent had already approached him. The guy took a swing and said that only he would continue the relationship with her. Harry wanted to defend himself and took out his sword, placing it in front of him. However, the guy's blow was so strong that it broke the sword and still hit him in the face. The man's teeth were knocked out and his nose was broken by the powerful blow. And then he immediately fell down, unable to continue the fight. As soon as he hit the ground, the countdown began. Lying unconscious, Harry didn't move at all. And then the guy was declared the winner for just 1 hit. Watching this, Nick thought that this guy was cool, and maybe it was worth talking to him after the tournament. However, with the help of his sight, he learned that Dixon was a romantic and a crazy idiot. So he changed his mind about talking to him. Dalcin became furious at the participants' victory and said that Harry was much stronger. While everyone was rejoicing, they discussed how glad they were that they had come up with a plan to attack after the event. By the end of the competition, Dixon was expected to run out of strength, and then they will take advantage of this and smear it mercilessly. Dalcin wanted to rip his ridiculous face apart as quickly as possible. And then he turned to the newcomer and asked what was there. Then the guy timidly admitted that a request had come from other guilds. It turned out that the guilds wanted to accept this guy. They also wanted to abort the plan to capture him by contacting the higher-ups. Enraged, Dalcin grabbed the poor guy and lifted him into the air. It turns out that almost all the guilds have set their sights on Dixon. After this, the fights between the participants continued. Following one opponent, Dixon managed to defeat another. While the audience was delighted, Nick was amazed by the strength of this guy. But he asked the princess to accept his feelings. He was really crazy. Nick thought it was ridiculous to think he was a girl, but at least that way his gender wasn't clear. Suddenly it was time for Group B, and Nick had to go into the arena. For the first time at the competition, the evil eye appeared. But the public hated him because he made it to the final without qualifying. But now he had to see his opponent. And his opponent was the former manager of the Sangoon Guild, Jack. Looking at his opponent, Nick thought that Jack had received help from the guild. Jack said the guy's build matched the one he was looking for, but Nick knew better than to answer and use the artifacts. Suddenly, Jack said that he would tear off this mask to see the real face, but Nick silently showed him the middle finger. Watching this, Kildors again found the guy interesting. This only made the atmosphere in the arena more tense. When the fight began, Nick was the first to attack, while Jack remained in place. Jack had to fight off not only his opponent, but also his clone. After Jack's attack, Nick had to step back a little. But almost immediately, he rushed into the attack again. At that moment, Jack understood that if he didn't concentrate, he would lose. But Nick, on the contrary, was very focused and serious. Suddenly, dark smoke began to appear around one of Jack's legs. After his leg fell through the ground, Nick decided to take advantage of the enemy's confusion. And having reached Jack, he was almost able to kill the enemy with his sword. However, Jack managed to put up a shield and prevent their collision. Afterwards, he immediately canceled the shield and tried to kick Nick. Nick had good reflexes, so he managed to react and duck. And at that very moment, Jack was blinded by a stream of water. As he clutched his face and leaned forward, Nick was about to attack. Because Jack was confused, Nick managed to hit him. Then people began to admire Nick's skills, and our hero decided to break Jack with this strength of spirit. Nick wanted to rush forward and attack, but suddenly froze in place. It turned out that his body was bound by a thread of mana. After this, Jack breathed a sigh of relief because he was finally able to catch his opponent. And right after that, he also decided to start attacking. Nick couldn't resist at that moment, so he had to take the punch to the stomach. But looking down, our hero immediately noticed the bombs. But on closer inspection, Nick realized that these were not bombs, but smoke shells. Then Nick decided that he needed to get rid of the threads first. But Jack crept up to him unnoticed and removed his mask, which automatically activated the shield in the form of a necklace. Seeing this, a creepy smile appeared on Jack's face, because in front of him was the one he was looking for. Nick stepped back, admitting that he was not happy to see Jack, but the other was, on the contrary, interested in learning a lot about John. Then Jack admitted that he had been ordered to check whether the beautiful princess was telling the truth. And it turned out that all the passages were true, except for the first section, which Jack did not remember. Jack also realized that the beautiful princess was not one person, but a group that possessed different information. And Nick understood that this was true, because he was given information about passing the 13th floor. And Jack made all this noise to ask John this question, because he had doubts while he was finding out about the information. And Jack said that he would continue to monitor whether the beautiful princess was posting truthful information. Nick was very surprised that, given the circumstances, Jack wanted to help the princess. When asked what the purpose of their group was, Nick replied that there was no particular purpose and that they were simply spreading truthful information. But Jack was surprised that all this was done only out of moral principle. Jack informed that he was the only one pursuing John now, and our hero asked if this was a betrayal. But for Jack, the guild was just a means. He only wanted to become stronger. Lifting his mask, Nick asked if Jack had told him everything. The smoke cleared and Jack suggested they see who would win. Jack wanted to say that he would win this time, but Nick had already rushed into battle. Using the mana threads again, the boy exclaimed that he was still talking. However, Nick ignored him and extended his hand towards him. Jack didn't have time to react, which is why Nick managed to grab him by the throat. After this, our hero managed to knock the guy to the ground. Then Nick finally realized that this was the best way to kill Jack. And with a grin, he said that they hadn't had fun for a long time. Realizing what his opponent would do next, Jack tensed up. After this, an explosion thundered in the middle of the arena. The explosion was so huge that it broke through the foundations of the arena. While someone was trying to get out of the hole, the spectators did not know who would win. But the winner was Nick, who had resistance to fire. Surprised by the boy's abilities, they immediately wanted to take him into the guild. And at that moment, Nick had only one fight left before the final. Our hero understood that in the end, he would be able to meet a bald man. When Nick said that they would see each other in the final, the guy was only happy about it. As Jack was carried out of the arena, Kildors explained that they would continue after the break. But Nick asked if he could start the fight right away if his opponent didn't mind. Upon hearing this, the next participant became furious that Nick, having won only once, had turned his nose up in the air. And then the man said to begin, angrily promising that he would defeat Nick in 5 seconds. But as soon as he finished his words, a stone flew into his face. And after that, the man fell from Nick's light attack. The countdown ended, and Nick was declared the winner. And he himself was pleased that he had dealt with his opponent in a second. After the break, they wanted to start the battle, and Dixon admitted that the Evil Eye was a strong opponent. Dixon immediately realized that Nick had an aggressive and calculated fighting style, as he had a defense strategy against the explosion. He also believed that the ability to see was a problematic skill, and although it didn't last long, one had to be careful. But Dixon was confident of his victory, because he had been hunting monsters before coming to the tower. The guy was determined to win and present his trophy to the beautiful princess. He wanted to do it just like in the movies, handing over all his achievements to the girl. He hoped that the girl would be deeply touched by this. But while he imagined himself to be the coolest, people around him looked at him strangely. But suddenly, he decided to check whether the princess was watching the competition right now. But when the boy learned that the princess had seen everything, he was delighted. The girl promised to meet him if he won the fight, so Dixon had good motivation. Nick was thinking at that moment that it was still too early for him to reveal his identity to the bald guy. Nick promised to meet him if he won, but he was much more confident of his own victory. The finale has finally arrived for 2 heroes who were still not in guilds. All the guilds immediately wanted to buy the prize from Nick in advance, but he didn't like this fuss. 3rd place was awarded 1,000 points and the opportunity to use the arena's gym. The prize for 2nd place was level B and 3,000 points. The public was delighted with this prize and could not imagine what would be given out for 1st place. And finally, Kildors was ready to present the prize for the victory. There were 4 prizes, a trophy, 5,000 points, and a skill book. And the 4th prize was the opportunity to summon Kildors. However, viewers were confused by the fact that the call only worked once. But despite this, they still understood that it was of great value, so they wanted to get the prize. They decided to put aside talk of prizes and begin the battle. Dixon admitted that he had fought with his bare hands, but now he wanted to use all his strength. In response, Nick simply suggested having some fun. The fight began, and Dixon was the first to attack. Because of this, Nick immediately recognized that the opponent was very fast. But then he abruptly looked down, and then he was able to dodge the next blow from Dixon's hand. Then Nick grabbed the sword with both hands and was about to attack. While Dixon was swinging his other hand, Nick wanted to hit the guy in the torso with the sword. However, Dixon was able to block Nick's blow with his hand, and a flash appeared in the middle of them. Dixon asked if Nick knew the princess, to which the guy replied that he knew her even better. This answer immediately threw the guy off balance. Enraged, he swung his arm and said that they had already made promises to each other, and Nick had lied to him. At that moment, it turned out that Nick was open to his opponent's blow. And the next moment, with his blow, Dixon created a large shockwave and air currents that did not allow one to see the guy. But when everything around became quiet, he could not see the enemy in front of him. But it turned out that Nick had snuck up from behind. This caught Dixon by surprise, but Nick simply held his hand out in front of his face. And then a fire appeared before Dixon's eyes. Nick's firebomb was powerful and should have killed Dixon. After this, the entire arena was engulfed in smoke. But Nick wanted to deal with him cleanly when he got the chance. But suddenly Nick was surprised. It turned out that Dixon had good self-defense. He said that it would not be possible to burn out his desire for the princess. Dixon said it was an amazing skill. It turns out that when the guy received a mortal wound, his abilities were enhanced. Then Nick was driven into a corner by this surprise. The battle continued, and Dixon's numbers only increased. Dixon asked with delight how Nick had found the attacks to taste. Nick knew that the enemy had several passive skills. Fighting back, Nick thought his opponent was being too aggressive. After all, he barely even received any damage. Then Nick used the threat skill. Dixon asked if they wanted to show him something. And then Nick used the gravity bracelet. He made a challenge, offering to stop his blow. And Dixon braced himself for impact. The next moment, they clashed in combat. The strong recoil threw Nick back. He was surprised that his attack with maximum severity was stopped. But Dixon had the self-defense and fortitude to do it. And then Nick realized that he could not have inflicted a mortal wound. He decided to use the Frost Flame sword. And Nick was truly delighted by this. Using his artifacts, he rushed into battle. But Dixon was not afraid of his opponent. Spectators were also delighted by their clash. Dixon continued to punch, and Nick used his water skill. And so their fight continued, in which they did not give in to each other. But at some point, Dixon hesitated. And right after that, his leg fell into Nick's trap. But Dixon already knew what the enemy was always aiming at. Suddenly, the ground broke under Dixon's feet. And then he cried out that such a trick would not work against overwhelming force. He was going to use one-hit kill. He also had a gauntlet that emitted a blast wave due to magic. And then there was an explosion. After him, Dixon already looked like a winner, and Nick was on his knees. At that moment, he was asked to admit defeat. But he only gripped his sword tighter. Dixon praised his opponent's fighting style, but suddenly his feet were covered in ice, and Nick approached him, intending to use the revenge skill. He wanted Dixon to experience the same pain he felt. Then panic broke out among the spectators. But Kildores decided to isolate that space. But because of the heavy smoke after the explosion, the winner was not visible. But soon everyone saw that Nick was the winner. While everyone was celebrating, the guy was a little surprised. Then he decided to look far ahead. And for some reason, I didn't see the people who were in the VIP zone. Then he suspected something was wrong. After the fight, Dixon was unconscious for some time. But soon he came to his senses and quickly rose from his seat. Thanks to notifications, the guy learned that he took second place. As a reward, he was given the dragon's poisonous breath. Having received it, the guy immediately ate the item. And the next moment, his indicators increased because of this. He thought that he would be stronger than the enemy, because they were on the same floors. But Dixon was mistaken. But the guy was still determined to become stronger. After writing about his defeat, Dixon saw another player making fun of him. He was surprised that they didn't even want to console him after the defeat. But there were many people waiting for him at the door. He was immediately told that he was under arrest, and if he resisted, he could be punished on the spot. The Eclipse and Dalcin guilds were ranked 6th and 7th. There were also 2 managers of the 10th floor there. Dixon realized that they wanted to catch him from the very beginning. But suddenly someone else intervened, standing up for Dixon. Then Dalcin ordered those people to be stopped. When they were taken away, the men told them to wait for orders from above. But Dalcin had not yet been informed of anything, and he believed it was correct to do things as originally planned. They were also the main ones on the 10th floor, and there were also guild rules. Afterwards, Dalcin said that the guy needed to be detained. Saying that he could not watch the princess being insulted, Dixon prepared for battle. After this, everyone rushed to the attack. Meanwhile, Nick was looking for Lilka. But suddenly he met someone on the way. Nick asked Kildores if there were any fights left for 3rd and 4th place. But after Nick's final, the man was bored watching other fights. Then Nick decided to ask if he had seen Lilka. Kildores agreed to take the boy to her. During his journey, Kildores decided to ask about Nick's opponent in the final. Nick recognized the guy's strength because he climbed the floors faster. Nick decided to admit that this was their first meeting in person. And then he asked why the man was talking about a bald head. But he only replied that he liked that guy. Entering inside, Kildores announced that guests had arrived for Lilka. But the girl only asked what happened. Returning for Darren, Nick handed over the dragon scale. But Lilka was very surprised by this. When she saw the scales, she couldn't believe it. And Nick at that moment was already happily heading towards Darren. But suddenly he was surprised. For some reason, Darren was wearing a strange outfit. He immediately decided to look up at the man who had arrived. And recognizing Nick, he jumped out of his suit towards him. Then Lilka was upset that Darren never hugged her. Suddenly, Nick decided to ask his pet about something. He asked if Darren really had such taste in clothes. But the frog only hit him in the face. And while he was angry, Nick had to apologize. And Nick felt as if they had actually met again. Nick was happy, but Lilka was saddened by the fact that she had lost both the frog and the sword. But suddenly everyone heard a strange roar. This made Kildoris angry. Nick learned from the community that Dixon had been attacked. Suddenly, Kildoris decided to offer a quest. The quest was to rescue Dixon, which Nick immediately accepted. Then he thought that everyone should be careful if they acted on his advice. The others tried to hide their identities, but Dixon didn't care. Soon, Nick almost came to the right place. It turned out that Dixon was being attacked from all sides. After the battle, Dixon was exhausted. But Nick decided to intervene anyway. Suddenly, Simai shouted that the right side was open. He just stood to the side and gave orders. Nick decided to attack him first. Everyone was surprised by his intervention. Nick didn't give them time to think and was going to use the explosion. And there was an explosion. After him, the manager was defeated. And Nick turned to the guy and said that he came for Dixon. But he didn't understand why the evil eye came here. Nick replied that he came at the princess's request. Dixon was grateful but angry about it. Nick asked to re-equip and prepare for a fight. Dixon admitted that he could fight for about 5 minutes. But Nick thought that 3 minutes would also be enough. And then the battle began. Dixon took on one part of the opponents, but he was attacked from behind. Luckily, Nick was able to cover for him. And then he asked if Dixon was okay. After asking him to be careful, Nick continued to the dragon. Dyson was angry that the boys still had some energy left after the competition. Someone tried to report that the order to take prisoner had been cancelled. Dyson was not happy that he could not gain power from people's reactions. And Nick noticed that his strength had hardly increased. The guy decided it was better to attack the head first. As he walked away, he asked Dixon to hold out without him. And approaching Dyson, he rammed the enemies. The man then asked Nick why he was helping Dixon. But Nick refused to answer and attacked. Then he suddenly said that Dyson was weaker than Jack. This angered Dyson. Dyson was weaker than Nick, but he resisted thanks to his equipment. But our heroes decided to deprive him of this advantage. Darren spat on the man's armor, but the saliva didn't land on them, but under the armor. The man immediately fell to the floor due to terrible pain. And from the pain, he grabbed his chest with his hands. The protection was removed, and Nick was going to take advantage of it. And then he dealt with the killer. Afterwards, Nick wanted to report that he had dealt with the floor manager. But Dixon was being beaten at that moment, and the guy was only able to call for help. Nick ran up to him and used a firebomb. And then he helped him up and asked if Dixon was okay. But the enemy kept crawling out like ants. Nick noticed that he was gradually getting tired too, but he noticed the beam. He decided to follow him and looked out the window. It turned out that the beam was created by Jack. The guy had several bombs in his hand, and he decided to throw them to Nick's opponents. Everyone paid attention to the arriving balloons. And after that, everyone couldn't see anything because of the smoke. Everyone covered their mouths, fearing that it might be poison, and Nick ran away amid the noise. And Nick realized that Jack hadn't lied when he said he would help them. And thanks to Jack, they could now escape. And then he was able to escape with Dixon. While the guy was unconscious, Nick thought that they had just a little while left to hold out. Afterwards, Dixon was placed in a treatment device and was expected to return to normal within a day. Kildor said the boy was too exhausted and would have died if he had had the wounds. Nick began to blame himself for what happened, because they were being hunted in a safe zone. Nick thought he needed help from those in power. Kildors wanted to give the boy the elixir for a reward. But Nick interrupted him and wanted to say something. But Kildoris was surprised by this. Nick asked Lilka what would happen when the NPC's level of interest in Nick increased. The girl awkwardly replied that he would gain trust in them. It turns out that you could become friends with NPCs, but many treated them like robots. Nick realized that depending on the relationship, it would be possible to ask for favors. Nick asked if he could refuse the reward and ask for something else. Kildoris was surprised by this, so he wanted to listen to the guy. Nick wanted to ask about his other friends who were soon to go up to the 10th floor. The man replied that he had heard a little about them, and soon they really had to go up to this floor. Then Nick admitted that he was the beautiful princess. In this way, he wanted to show his trust and get their help. Nick asked the NPC to protect his friends. The NPCs were surprised when they heard this, but Kildoris already guessed about this, and Lilka just laughed loudly. The girl said that Nick had strange addictions, but Nick replied that he could not reveal himself due to circumstances. Lilka immediately agreed to help, and she asked what Kildoris thought about it. And he also agreed, because he didn't like how the big guilds turned up their noses. They promised to take care of Dixon. Nick was glad that they promised to keep his identity a secret. However, Lilka wanted to get something in return. The girl wanted to touch Darren every time they met. When the request was fulfilled, Nick wanted to leave, but Kildoris stopped him, and he threw some object to Nick. It turned out that he had received an extract of the giant's heart. It was a gift from Kildoris. Nick was told to rise until he hit the ground. For some time after this, Nick thought about what he had heard, and then he left the arena. Then Nick was surprised, because he hadn't received good treatment for free for a long time. The guy relied on the NPCs, but he was going upstairs, but he wanted to defeat the managers once again. Nick was asked to reveal his identity, but he had already attacked the guards. Having quickly killed them, Nick moved forward. He burst in with a loud noise. Having forced his way inside, Nick said that they had touched the wrong person. After this, explosions began to destroy the guild. Kildoris watched this from afar. Suddenly, he turned around at Lilka's words that she didn't recognize him. Lilka asked why he carried out Nick's requests and treated Dixon, and the man admitted that he simply found a successor, and the guy had to have whole limbs so that he could go through the training. But realizing what was happening, Lilka boiled over. Lilka was angry that Kildoris was choosing a successor so suddenly, something that was only allowed to be done once. But along with the treatment, Kildoris also contributed some of his own efforts. To keep Lilka from burdening herself with thoughts, Kildoris offered her a sweet. While she grabbed the lollipop, Kildoris continued to talk about Nick. He thought that Lilka also remembered someone when she looked at Nick, which is why she gave him that quest. However, the girl denied this. Kildoris was writhing in pain, and Lilka was angry. She continued eating the lollipop in silence, and then she angrily bit into the sweetness. Meanwhile, Nick arrived on the 14th floor. The indicators now rose from catching monsters, but after dealing with the boss, they became even better. As a reward, Nick was given a black chroma key. To avoid recognition, he decided to change the color of the hidden reward. Then he decided to take a rest and then publish the walkthrough. But Nick decided to read the community. It turns out that 2 of the managers left the tower after a battle with Nick. Darren was tired, and Nick was thinking that now other guilds would be careful. It turns out that Kildoris banned guilds from participating in battles for 5 years in the event of an attack. Nick didn't know why exactly, but Kildoris used a strong method. 2 guilds have already been banned from the arena, so other guilds will be wary. And Lizun and Meow Punch also had to go up to the 10th floor. Nick hoped that Lilka would give bad quests to bad guys and leave him alone. After watching Lilka's quest, Nick thought that he had received help from her too, so they were even. After the warning was posted and the walkthrough was completed, Nick wanted to move on. Then he found himself on the 15th floor. Moving forward, Nick thought as if someone had started a fire here. There were skeletons of the slain who had come to life, and witches who were unable to use their curses. On that floor, there was a burnt village, as well as a plague and witches. And Nick immediately found himself a victim for Purification. Soon, Nick began to deal with all the monsters. He also found out that witches were causing the plague, so the village was burned down. But he also smelled the scent of hidden treasure. The zombies grew stronger from the witch's scream. They became angrier and headed towards the guy. Then Nick realized that they were being controlled by a witch, and he immediately headed towards her, wanting to attack. Nick decided it was best to deal with her first. The witch was surprised that the guy immediately headed towards her, and then Nick used the firebomb. He immediately thought that the witch was a weak opponent, but he noticed something was wrong and turned back. The zombies took damage but were still chasing the guy. Screaming in pain, they continued to approach him, and Nick didn't understand what was happening to them. Nick realized that they were unconscious, so he dealt with them easily, but it seemed strange to him. For some reason, the monsters only reacted to explosive and fire attacks. But after the zombies, Nick met skeletons. Then he decided to use the explosion as well. However, the skeletons, on the contrary, hardly reacted to the fire. So Nick decided to use the water skill. There was no reaction to the water either, so he asked Darren to attack as well. The frog's attacks also showed no reaction. Nick tried everything, but the zombies were getting closer to him. While running from the skeletons, Nick decided it was better to deal with them all at once. And after running a little, Nick decided to attract attention to himself, and then he dug a large hole into which the skeletons fell. The skeletons were obviously trapped because they were unable to think. And then Nick decided to try the explosion on them again. The skeletons were not damaged, but the pit began to crumble. They tried to get out, but almost immediately they were buried under the earth. Nick was horrified when he saw the red eyes of the monsters for the last time, after which he used the bomb on them again. Then Nick thought that the skeletons seemed to be asking him for mercy. Wanting to get away from this gloomy atmosphere as soon as possible, Nick wanted to find the treasure as quickly as possible. But suddenly he found a creepy doll. However, the information about the doll seemed like a warning to heretics. Suddenly, Nick thought that the monsters had once been heretics, and they had been burned at the stake or buried alive. The boy realized that this was why they were called victims of purification. But suddenly he wondered whether it was possible to use the word sacrifice for heretics. The witch couldn't use spells, and the zombies were made of coal. Nick learned that the village had once been peaceful, but was now filled with embittered souls. And all these evil spirits were in one field. But it wasn't the plague that caused the village to burn down. It was a massacre. Nick agreed to the hidden quest, even though he couldn't see the information about it. But then the guy's legs started shaking. This made him wonder what was going on. And suddenly the found doll lit up. It emitted a bright golden light. And then the heretical sign was activated. Nick felt that someone was behind him and tensed. A sacred weapon appeared before him, purifying heretics with flame. When the cleansing began, the weapons attacked. Nick was surprised that everything happened so unexpectedly. However, when the weapon struck, Nick was able to dodge. But it turned out they weren't aiming at him, but at the monster. They didn't pay attention to Nick and fought among themselves. And for the first time, Nick saw the monsters fighting so hostilely. Nick couldn't find any information and was given no clues. And while the monsters were fighting, he had to think. He already knew that the weapon was created by the Order of Fire. In words, it was a sign, but in reality, it was a murder weapon. Most likely, the Order warned that they needed to change their religion, but the village refused, for which they were dealt with. The villagers were labeled as evil spirits and mercilessly killed. Nick believed that since the quest appeared after he learned the truth, he was on the side of the evil spirits. He assumed that if he figured out the reason, he would get information about the quest. And then Nick headed forward. The most important thing in capturing golems was to destroy the core. And knowing this, Nick immediately destroyed the core. However, after this, he still did not receive information about the quest. But suddenly he thought of something else. Nick noticed that the evil spirits were afraid of the sacred power, but ran towards the guardians who possessed the power. The guy assumed that this happened because of a thirst for revenge. But suddenly, one golem decided to attack the guy. Nick took little damage but became angry. Nick asked Darren to help him in the battle. And immediately, the frog directed fire at the monster. And while he was blinded, Nick also attacked him. But the battle of monsters also continued. Nick couldn't do anything about the monsters being inferior to the sacred weapon. And later, he watched as the monsters were driven to the center of the village. However, in Nick's opinion, the monsters looked strange, as if they were protecting the center of the village. Nick asked Darren if he thought there was something to it. However, the sacred weapon was getting closer, and eventually they started to smash the center of the village. After a while, Nick came down to the ground. He didn't understand why there were ruins in the center. He also felt an energy that made him shiver. He believed that the divine power was attributed to heretical, and even Nick's sword reacted to this place. But Nick soon became convinced of this. He was sure that the key that would help him complete the quest was here, and he actually managed to find something. Using his digging skill, Nick found a statue of an ice goddess. It turns out that the Order of Ice disappeared because of the Order of Fire. But suddenly Nick realized that the ruins of High Alton should have been here. Then he got the key to these ruins. But at the very last moment, he thought he was wrong. But he also found records that belonged to the villagers. Previously, the Order split, and the Order of Fire won, but the Order of Ice lost. Nick believed that an incident from the past was being recreated. It was strange that the curtains attacked the village, and the evil spirits defended it. Nick finally understood that this time the evil spirits wanted to protect the village. After that, they started showing him information about the quest. Nick saw in front of him a whole statue of Prelia, the ice goddess. Suddenly, the goddess began her patronage. Nick was very surprised by this. The evil spirits began to overflow with spiritual power, and suddenly one of them grabbed his sword. Before our eyes, the evil spirits began to transform and become ordinary people. At first, Nick thought he was hallucinating, but the rest of the evil spirits were also transformed. And after this, it was not evil spirits that began to fight with the sacred weapon, but living people. But the remaining evil spirits also entered the battle. Nick was surprised that all the first-level evil spirits were modified, but the skeleton knight changed into a zombie mountain, and the witch received power and also began to change her image. It turned out that she had previously been a priestess. However, her appearance was still just as terrible. Soon, almost all the Guardians were defeated. But suddenly Nick thought he saw their leader. The Purification Envoy was a weapon of the Order of Fire and was forged from the divine power of the fire god Petrodon. The witch who suddenly approached scared Nick. However, at that moment the balance of power was equalized. But on Nick's side, the 4th level monster was a support type. On the other hand, there were fighting type monsters. Due to his cooldown, Nick was still unable to use the artifacts, and he decided it was time to pull out his trump card, the Giant's Heart Extract. And at that very moment, Nick felt the effect of it. Then Nick was ready to send his army into battle. The guy intended to defeat the side of the Order of Fire. Nick made quick work of the Guardians. However, he felt that they seemed to have no end, and something had to be done with the Messenger of Purification too. Nick agreed with the witch that he also wanted to kill him. However, the quest was to protect the village, and Nick didn't believe that the evil spirits would maintain their protection while he fought the leader. But suddenly the witch began to cast some kind of spell. Suddenly Nick felt strengthened and improved, and his fever subsided. Other evil spirits have also received a boost. It turns out that the witch wanted Nick to go fight the leader himself. Nick obeyed and immediately began to move forward. But suddenly a barricade of gradients formed. Nick thought it would be difficult to get through. But suddenly one knight called the guy to him. After that, they were able to overcome the barricade. And Nick was very happy about it. However, the monsters got angry and still tried to block the way. Then Nick thought they wouldn't be able to get through. So Nick decided to go on his own. While running away, he managed to thank the knight. And jumping over heads, the guy approached the leader. And then Nick was ready to attack. And he managed to do it by hitting him on the head. For some reason, the sword entered the helmet smoothly. And then fire burst out from there. Having fallen to the ground, Nick immediately tried to get to his feet. Then the guy noticed that the monster was quickly recovering. But Nick was still glad that the golems died after the core was destroyed. But suddenly the guy was surprised. It turned out that the entire body of the monster was the core. However, Nick was not upset by this fact. And then he rushed into battle again. Having struck, the monster destroyed the earth. But Nick had already approached him from behind at that moment. Then he tried to make the giant freeze. Gradually, the ice covered the monster's body. And then Nick was going to cause a fiery explosion. At that moment, the monster received a strong blow. And Nick was thrown back by the recoil. It turned out that after the explosion, the monster split into 2 pieces. Nick asked with a smile how the monster had managed to do this. But suddenly, the messenger began to regenerate. Nick was a little confused after watching his movements. At that moment, 2 monsters appeared in front of him, and both of them attacked the guy at the same time. But he didn't lose his composure and decided to use fog acceleration. But for some reason, this didn't help Nick. The next moment, there was an explosion. Nick was seriously injured after that blow. Then he thought that such regeneration was unfair, and then he immediately received another blow. Nick was thrown back by the attack. At that moment, the guy was already exhausted. But the enemies continued to advance. When they attacked, Nick managed to use fog acceleration. He reassured himself that this was a planned retreat. But the enemies did not want to leave him alone and approached again. When Nick was hit in the back, he didn't have time to react. Then the enemies surrounded Nick again, and then they simultaneously took aim at him. At that moment, Nick decided that he was going to die now. But suddenly there was a roar, but no blow followed. It turned out that a knight stood up for Nick. With both hands, the knight was able to stop the blow of the enemy's weapon. However, it was difficult for him to continue standing like that. Nick was surprised when he was told to leave. The skeleton continued to speak to the guy in his own language, but he promised to cope here without Nick. Having obeyed the knight, Nick left that place. However, he had to sacrifice himself for the boy. But he needed to knock both of them down to have a chance of winning. One of the monsters was heading towards the village. Nick knew they had to be stopped before the village was burned to the ground. All of Nick's abilities contained fire, so he knew he wouldn't be able to fight the Order of Fire. So Nick decided to choose a new skill book. He immediately began reading about other skills available to him. Suddenly, he noticed the possibility of combining skills. The guy was surprised that he hadn't even tested the skills, but decided to combine them right away. Now Nick had a level A skill at his disposal, returning the dead. Nick was delighted with the power of this ability, and now he was confident that he could cope with the quest. Realizing that luck was on his side, Nick wanted to combine his skills once again. But suddenly Nick saw a notification that the difference in the level of the 2 skills was too great. The system detected abnormal abilities and analyzed the correctness of this. But suddenly our heroes felt like they were being electrocuted. Afterwards, the system gave equality and wished Nick to rise to the 100th floor. But by this time, Nick had already managed to get scared. And then he mastered two more skills: a cutter and freezing breaks. He immediately headed towards his enemy and attracted attention to himself. Coming closer, Nick swung his sword easily. And he said that he would deal with this monster and then go defend the camp. Then the messenger of Purification began to change his appearance to a fighting one. And then they both rushed into battle. The messenger attacked with weapons and Nick with explosions. The guy did not take his eyes off his opponent and was very focused. And suddenly the messenger swung at him. But Nick knew he only needed one chance, and then he used fog acceleration. It turned out that due to his transformation into fog, the system considered him dead. The messenger tried to find the guy, and in the meantime, the conditions for activating the dead man's skill were met. Nick began to take on his usual form, and the messenger was about to hit him. When Nick's ability activated, he was able to stop the weapon with one hand. And then the giant's weapon began to freeze. The messenger did not expect this and was very surprised. Nick looked very scary at that moment. At that very second, he decided to use the freeze breaks and almost defeated his opponent. At the end, the messenger only managed to turn around. As his body began to fall apart, he saw the guy with his back to him. Then Nick received a notification that he had killed the messenger of Purification. The second messenger became tense because of this, but he also changed his appearance to a fighting one. But Nick was able to deal with him in a few moments. When this happened, the other monsters were also surprised. After defeating the Purification envoys, Nick received the element of fire. The gradients then began to gradually crumble. Then the village was recaptured and Nick completed the quest. Nick was surprised when the evil spirits began to rejoice at this, but suddenly everyone fell silent. And then they all parted for the witch. When she bowed to Nick, everyone else followed her lead. Then Nick was surprised that he received not only a boost from the monsters, but also gratitude. But suddenly the evil spirits became people again. And the witch, who had become a beautiful girl, said that they were all very grateful. But later, the real name of this floor was revealed: the Nightmare of Hugo Arte, the Defender of the Kingdom. Looking around, Nick thought that he was seeing an illusion, and he noticed that one girl had a sword of frost flame. Then Nick quickly ran to that girl, but the next second, fire appeared everywhere, and corpses lay on the ground. The Gradients attacked and burned people alive. At that moment, Nick didn't understand what was happening, and he heard someone speculate about whether history would have changed if the man had returned a day earlier. Nick thought he saw something significant, and he also had access to performance gains. But Nick didn't understand what this vision meant. Suddenly, he noticed that there was a shiny object lying on the ground. It turns out that Nick had the element of ice in his hands. While Nick did not understand how the orders, the Kingdom of Hyalton and the Sword of Frostflame were connected, Nick thought that the luck indicator reacted to Lilka's sword because of this quest. While he was thinking, a new portal appeared. For some reason, Nick couldn't stop thinking about the villagers. Thinking that he was uneasy, the guy decided to move on. Hugo Arte felt grateful to Nick, and now the boy could patronize fire. There was fire everywhere on the 16th floor. Nick was horrified to think that he had not received a reward for the quest. Nick was upset, and fire spirits who showed friendliness followed him. The spirits were monsters, but they could help climb the tower. If a person received a skill related to souls, he became a patron of souls. Nick thought the 16th floor was easy, but suddenly I saw that Darren was covered in fire. Then Nick asked if he was jealous that Nick called the spirits cute, but Darren only punched the guy in the face. Then Nick had to apologize, calling Darren the cutest. Looking at the frog's butt, Nick thought he had overfed him. Only then did he notice that everything was on fire, and for some reason he didn't feel the heat. But he decided it was time to raise his skill level. Having made the upgrade, Nick thought that he was spending points with the same difficulty that he earned them. But now Nick could kill low-level monsters with his bare hands. And Nick wanted to take a look at the community, because he had completely stopped caring about the guys. Now the guilds couldn't just attack, and Dixon was receiving lessons from Kildoras. And Meow Punch was on a quest with the Empress on the 10th floor. Nick laughed because the slime was the only one with nothing better to do. However, he decided to storm the 20th floor and look for the princess. Nick decided to hurry and move on because he didn't want to cross paths with the slime. But Darren asked why Nick hadn't written about getting past the 15th floor. But that quest had a lot of unclear conditions and variables, so Nick risked getting a negative reaction. But Nick stopped in front of the portal. He told the spirits that when they met the slime, they should be friendly. But the slime was upset that the princess did not answer him, and the slime wanted to know which of them would win. There was a desert on the 17th floor. The monsters weren't a burden to Nick, but he wanted to find an oasis. He immediately ducked down, preparing to jump. And from his jump, sand rose into the air, and then he used the explosions to guide himself. Soon after, he found an oasis. Nick didn't think they would find him so quickly. But the next moment they began to fall. Having jumped into the air, Nick did not think about how they would descend. Suddenly, he decided to throw Darren higher, and he himself continued to fall down. He then used Fog Boost and caught Darren. After that, Darren was a little scared, but immediately he got angry. Tried to hit Nick, but the guy dodged. Nick asked if Darren thought the guy wouldn't be able to dodge. But then Darren decided to use fire. Nick didn't expect this at that moment. Because of this, he also got angry at the frog. And because of the noise, the monsters woke up. But Nick dealt with them easily, and he continued to be angry at Darren. But Darren believed that there was no need to look for them now. But Nick noticed movement behind him. It turned out that there were only more monsters. And then Nick agreed that Darren was telling the truth. And soon Nick dealt with the required number of monsters. They were glad that they had passed the 17th floor so quickly. They wanted to rest for a while, but Nick noticed that the ruins key was reacting. Because of this, Nick took it in his hand. And then he noticed that a portal had formed near the oasis. Nick was sure there were ruins here, but he couldn't find them. Tired, Nick asked Darren to help him search. However, Darren refused to help. But Nick threatened him that Darren would be left without meat. Suddenly, he noticed that he was holding pieces of ruins in his hands. When Nick praised Darren for his genius, the frog missed the point. For some reason, Nick decided to look into the water. Peering into the depths, the boy thought he had found it. However, it seemed to Nick that the cave was very deep. Then he decided to look for equipment to operate underwater. Not knowing what to choose, Nick decided to turn to Jean. Nick said he was in the water, but was surprised by the suggestion that he was about the 30th floor. Nick was delighted when he received information on how to make a fishman mask. It was necessary to skin a fish that had a human face, and then keep it in a slightly acidic solution. Then dry it and you will have a mask. Nick bought the scale coating, but was only able to make about 80 scales. But the scales could also be used for an elixir. It was possible to make a higher-level elixir by adding scales and other ingredients. Realizing how much money he would get for it outside, Nick began to collect scales with him. But Darren only exhaled heavily. Soon, they jumped into the water and headed deeper. Now Nick didn't have to worry about breathing underwater. But suddenly they stopped and looked at each other in surprise. It turns out they were near the entrance to the ruins. Inserting the whole key, Nick opened their gate. Then our heroes were very surprised. And now they were ready to enter the ruins. Taking off his mask, Nick complained that it smelled like fish. But Darren asked to look up. The ruins contained the orders of fire and ice. Nick immediately decided that two goddesses were depicted, and then he was glad that he would be able to get the relics in this place. But suddenly his sword began to react to something. Nick decided that the sword was reacting to the relics. But immediately, everything around me began to change. Nick received a notification that he had to prove his strength. But Nick was not afraid when he saw his enemies. The guy thought it would be a good warm-up. Nick soon dealt with each of them. But third-level enemies were waiting for him. At the same time, they pounced on the guy. But Nick dodged the first blow. He considered the enemy to be fast, but they were approaching him again. When Nick reacted, the enemy was very close. But the guy managed to stop the blow with his sword. While Nick blocked one attack, they wanted to hit him from behind. The next moment, the monsters attacked. But Nick used fog acceleration. Afterwards, he and Darren also decided to show their strength. Darren's saliva was slowly eating away at the armor. Nick shoved the weapon into the resulting hole. Then he said to get ready. And then he started using the explosion. After this, the monster was torn apart from the inside. The other monster was surprised by this. But then Nick was already approaching him. Using the cutter skill, the boy killed the monster. At that moment, Nick's strength was recognized. Then Nick was glad that the messenger of Purification did not appear. Next, Nick had to walk on fire, which was expected from this temple. Even though Nick had high fire resistance, he still felt hot. Once the path was completed, Nick tried to cool down. But at that moment, Nick began to guess what the second obstacle was. And Nick was right. We had to go on through the frost. This was the road to the Order of Ice. Nick immediately asked Darren to turn on the stove mode. The guy was breaking apart some of the boulders. Then he thought that with Darren and the skill to break ice, The road would be easy. Soon he had to open the last door. When the door opened, a bright light poured out from behind it. But Nick's final obstacle was testing Magnarok. Whoever passed the test could choose a relic. The guy's eyes were wide open from the A-level relics. But at that moment, Magnarok greeted him. He explained that the support of the Order was elected in this place. But Nick had already demonstrated his abilities, so he was offered to choose a relic. But Nick could only feel it, not receive it. However, Nick was still dizzy from all the treasures. There were too many treasures in front of him to choose from. Using his vision, Nick quickly made his choice. Magnarok asked what the boy chose, but then he saw it himself. Nick wanted to choose the blade of the Frost Flame sword. Magnarok approved of the guy's choice. Nick was also delighted with this sword. But suddenly the element of fire began to merge with the sword. Nick didn't seem to expect this at that moment. But the fusion of the two objects produced a bright light. But after that, the Frost Flame sword regained its original appearance. Nick was glad that the sword even had an additional S-level option. But if Nick fails to gain Magnarok's recognition, the relic will be sealed. And at that moment, Magnarok decided to begin the test. When his hand fell to the ground, Nick was surprised, but its fragments began to come together into something. This is how the Guardian Phalanx was formed. Then Magnarok said that the Order of Fire and Ice had 3 dogmas. The first was the protection of what was most precious. Nick thought about the question of what was most precious to him. In fact, the boy's parents died, and he couldn't even wait for a call from his friends. And now he only had his colleagues in the tower, but Nick wasn't sure that he cared about them. Then Nick realized that he had lived a very sad life. But suddenly his attention began to be drawn to Darren, and then Nick was glad that he had this pet. Magnarok was a little confused by this, but he was ready to begin the test. Nick was asked to fight to protect what was dear to him. Then the guard pounced on the guy. He threw a punch, but Nick dodged it. Nick immediately realized that the sword had sacred power. He stretched out his hand, about to use the explosion, and he managed to hit the enemy in this way. However, the guard received little damage from the explosion. Almost immediately, his limbs began to regenerate. Nick found this incredible and asked Darren to attack. By hitting the target, Darren slowed down his regeneration. Then Nick used the cutter skill. Nick was glad of the ending, but Magnarok thought it was not enough, and he began to create many opponents who would be equal in strength to Nick. But Nick was surprised that there were so many of them. Because of this, he used the enhancement cube and attacked, with additional damage for a triple hit. Nick decided that since there were a lot of enemies, he would go straight ahead. Then he used a firebomb, and he continued to crush them with the blow of his sword. One after another, he continued to destroy his opponents, and gradually their remains formed around him. Magnarok found Nick incredibly strong, and Nick was the first one to come here with the relic. But the monsters kept coming closer, and the next moment, several of them merged into one. This made him more terrifying, and Nick was glad that he had saved the artifacts. When the monster attacked, Nick was able to stop the attack. However, from the collision of two forces, everything around collapsed. But thanks to the attack, Nick was able to absorb almost all the necessary damage, and soon the monster saw a light appear in front of him. After this, a powerful explosion occurred. After the explosion, someone's figure was visible from the smoke, and when the smoke settled, it was clear that Nick had survived the battle. The monster only had its core to destroy, and by destroying it, Nick spread the ice, and then he asked what the next dogma was. Magnarok was surprised by this outcome. Nick asked if he thought the guy was that strong. However, Nick knew he was tired and tried to hide it. Nick used almost all the skills except the Dead Man and Fog, and Darren's abilities remained. And then Magnarok congratulated him on passing the first dogma. After that, something started to happen in the room. When the cube's power-up ended, Nick used it again, and Nick was given the power to strengthen the spirit of demons. At that moment, he was glad that he had got a 6 for the first time. However, the mana consumption was also high. Suddenly, Darren noticed that a spirit had come out of Nick. This spirit materialized based on Nick's magical power. The man who owned this spirit rose to the 84th floor. The spirit wanted to attack, but Nick stopped him. Then Nick asked him to fight in a way that would be within the boy's strength. Magnarok was surprised that Nick overcame the first dogma with the help of ice. Nick was grateful for the praise, but wanted to move on to the second dogma. But at first, Nick did not understand what the blessing of fire on the second dogma meant. And then light poured out from Magnarok's crown. For Nick, that light became too bright, and the next moment someone's blood was spilled. It was revenge. At first, Nick didn't understand what had happened, and then he turned his worried gaze to the side. It turned out that Magnarok killed Darren. Tears came to Nick's eyes when his pet died. At that moment, Magnarok told Nick to burn like fire, but this only made Nick angry. And then, without hesitation, he rushed into battle. Nick used the blast and the cutter without stopping. At that moment, he saw Darren's video in front of his eyes, and the feeling of guilt ate away at our hero. Nick regretted that he couldn't protect his friend. Then Magnarok said that being honest in one's feelings is the nobility of fire. But Nick did not want to listen to anything and demanded silence from Magnarok. Then the guy used the water skill, and having doused the enemy with water, Nick froze him. However, this attack was not enough, and Nick was surprised when they wanted to attack him. Realizing that he couldn't dodge, the guy just closed his eyes. And then it turned out that the spirit had covered Nick. Having given the command to hold the enemy, Nick rushed forward. And then he angrily wished death on Magnarok. And at that moment, Nick used fire and ice at the same time. And then he gave the command to the spirit. Nick demanded that he hit with all his might. With a stern face, the spirit replied that it would be done. And then he delivered one precise blow to the enemy. After this, Nick was exhausted, and everything around was in ashes. While Nick was trying to catch his breath, the spirit approached him. Then Nick told the spirit to return, because the guy had little strength left. Finally, the spirit said that the sacred creature could only be destroyed by magic or chaos, and the tower took a lot from them. And the spirit hoped that they would see each other again someday. But Nick was devastated at that moment. Then he used fog shift and dead person return. Coming closer, Nick asked how he dared kill Darren. Because of this, Nick wanted Magnarok to die too. And then Nick used revenge. All the accumulated power was released and Nick was exhausted. The guy swore because he was tired. Then he learned that it was impossible to destroy Magnarok. Nick thought maybe he should have aimed for that crown. Having recovered, Magnarok again praised Nick and said that no one had ever gone to such lengths. But he said that the fiery path had a vanishing perishability when everything was burned. However, Nick didn't want to listen to this. And then Nick rushed into battle again. But Magnarok wanted to tell about the third dogma. It turns out that forgiveness was at the heart of the harmony between fire and ice. He wanted Nick to accept reality and moderate his anger. Nick was required to say that he forgives Magnarok. But Nick was very surprised when he heard this. He couldn't forget what happened to Darren, and Nick couldn't forgive it. This made him want to attack again. And while attacking, the guy wished death on the enemy. Nick was furious that Magnarok wanted forgiveness after Darren's death. But Magnarok told Nick not to strain himself so much because he didn't have any strength left anyway. At some point, Nick dropped his sword, and then he started falling to the floor. At that moment, Magnarok continued to say that anger could not solve everything. So, in his opinion, Nick should stop. But Nick didn't want to give up and started using his fists. Nick ignored the words that he needed to stop, and he continued to smash his fists until they bled. But at some point, Magnarok's patience ran out. Then Magnarok said that he who does not know how to forgive is not worthy of becoming the support of the order. But Nick said he didn't need peace of mind or becoming part of an order. He wanted the power to ensure that nothing like this would happen again. But suddenly, Nick's whole body was bound by a thread. Magnarok said that Nick cannot forgive. Therefore, he is not worthy. But Nick replied that if Magnarok wanted forgiveness, he should have apologized first. Magnarok didn't listen to the guy and promised to take the relic and plunge Nick into eternal sleep. But Nick was angry that he stood his ground until the end. Then he decided to use his dagger. Magnarok thought it was stupid that the boy was torturing himself out of anger. However, the dagger began to absorb Nick's blood. And when the required amount was consumed, the curse began. And Magnarok was preparing to show his final gesture of care. But Nick showed him the middle finger and promised to take the sword with him. After this, Nick's body began to deteriorate, and then he died before Magnarok's eyes. After this, silence reigned in the room. But soon, Magnarok began to panic about what had happened. When Nick returned, he also received the title of Relic Robber. But immediately remembering what happened, Nick promised to avenge Darren. But it turned out that the frog was lying next to the guy. Nick's eyes filled with tears of joy at the sight of him. And then he climbed up to hug the surprised frog. Because of this, Nick didn't notice that Darren was short of breath. Nick continued to rejoice that the pet was resurrected together with its owner. But at one point, Darren got tired of putting up with it. After some time, they moved outside. Nick's entire face was twisted due to Darren's poison. Then Nick saw that his sword was sealed. But he was glad that he was able to escape thanks to the dagger, and also pumped up his poison resistance because of Darren. But Nick considered his new title to be his best achievement. And immediately, Nick decided to go and check what this title was worth. It was said that Magnarok could not be destroyed. That's why Nick wanted to attack him not physically, but mentally. The sound of a door opening was heard in the middle of the room. Magnarok thought that another brave man had managed to get here. He was impressed that the man was comparable in strength to the previous one. Magnarok believed that Nick would be a good support if he could forgive. He didn't understand how the guy could laugh at him and steal the relic. He hoped that at least now a worthy person would appear, and perhaps he will be able to restore the lost order. Magnarok wished to meet a believer who could satisfy his boredom. Then the brave man entered the Temple of Ice and Fire. As soon as the man entered, Magnarok began to greet him, but suddenly he fell silent and looked surprised. It turned out that Nick was in front of him again. The battle began almost immediately. While attacking the boy, Magnarok called him unclean and ill-mannered. But Nick managed to dodge all the attacks, but some of the explosions sent debris flying towards him. The guy dealt with them using his weapon. Magnarok was surprised by the guy's strength. Nick showed his middle finger and said that he had seen this move 6 times already, and he came to this place on the 7th. Such impudence angered Magnarok, but Nick remained focused. Nick would have gotten hurt before, but now he had resilience. Now Nick had the title of attacker, and some of his stats had increased. But Magnarok was angry at the impudent man and demanded that he hand over the relics. He said that such things were not for people like Nick. But Nick said that if he wanted to take the things back, he should apologize to the guy. Nick was glad that this time he also got a good thing. Nick said he had too many relics and maybe he should have given them away to someone. But Nick didn't understand how he should respect the relics if they weren't even human. Seeing Nick mocking the relic, Magnarok became angry. Then Nick had already placed the relic on his head, and Magnarok used a withering glare on the guy. But Nick didn't take any damage because he had heat resistance. Nick said happily that he loved the warmth. Suddenly, Magnarok said that if Nick apologized and returned the relics, Magnarok would forgive him too. And Nick repeated that he wanted Magnarok to apologize to Darren on his knees. But Magnarok replied that if he knelt, it would mean that the entire order bowed before Nick. But Nick thought that these were only his problems, because if Magnarok doesn't apologize, Nick will come again. Hearing this, Magnarok tensed up. He immediately bowed down and apologized to Darren. Then Nick asked if that made Darren feel any better, and the frog jumped on Magnarok's head. But he didn't understand what was happening, and then he felt the liquid flowing down him. Darren was pleased with this. After that, he jumped towards Nick again. After Nick returned the relic, Darren had calmed his anger. As he left, Nick said that he shouldn't touch family members who were dear to someone, and that he would take the parting gift. Not understanding what this meant, Magnarok was surprised. But it turned out that his crown had been stolen. Nick was pleased with how he had turned everything out. But Magnarok only got angry and tried to stop the guy. At that moment, Nick took out his dagger. Having pierced his finger, he happily said that he was leaving. After this, Magnarok was left alone again. He even burst into tears out of frustration. And then he began to take out his anger on the floor, saying that he would make sure that Nick never came here again. Nick and Darren were pleased with the work done. The crown enhanced and strengthened leadership qualities. But it wasn't a relic, so it didn't add any sacred power. So Nick decided to find something else. However, Nick was forbidden to enter the ruins, and the key disintegrated. Nick thought the limit was low, but he had a good time, so he was happy. Leeson decided to thank Nick for the information about the mask, so he gave him the unknown parchment. Nick was exhausted from the last week, but was glad that he was able to score points. Nick decided to spend his points and bought power-up coupons. He didn't improve all his skills because he didn't have enough points. And to become strong, Nick had to spend a lot of money. He decided to improve some skills and buy something else with the remaining points. Then he combined the skills. Nick has received a silver shop level, so there are more skills to choose from. Using his eyes, Nick determined what would be best to take. But suddenly, he was surprised. He was surprised by the skill he found. On the street, everyone was discussing the beautiful princess's new post. The publication became official, so there was a fuss. She said that there were several abilities that were worth a lot of points. But everyone was happy that the princess was ready to give 2 skills for free to one random person. Many were glad that the large guilds would not get anything. This made the guild representatives angry. There was a loud burst into Sam's office. Having burst in, the girl asked if he knew why they had come. Sam said he saw that post too. but he suggested calming down and talking calmly. But they were angry that they too were suffering losses and were being pressured by other guilds. Sam asked what the other guilds wanted. It turns out the guilds didn't want the beautiful princess to be touched. Sam replied that then they were out of the deal. Sam replied that they had widened the gap with other guilds, so they couldn't miss out on those skills. Standing up, Sam demanded that everyone gather. He said he had a plan. Meanwhile, Nick was happy about something. He continued to learn new skills. Nick was happy that he would get a lot of points if he sold his skills. Nick believed that trading with guilds was profitable, but he wanted to give one skill to his friend Meow Punch. Nick couldn't stop being happy that the guilds had bowed before him. But suddenly Jin asked the princess if she knew about the options of a personal deal. After learning more about this, Nick decided to take advantage of this feature. And then he decided to see what photos his guys had taken. Dixon entertained himself. Lizin started running a social network. And Meow Punch has now become a merchant. It turns out that Lizin had already found himself on the 20th floor while Nick was dealing with Magnarok. Then he asked Darren if they should go already. Soon he was standing in front of the entrance to the 19th floor. Then he learned that the 19th floor was a boss fight. For some it was easy, but for others it was just not possible. But Nick was determined to push through until he could do it. After that, he was on his way to the boss. The fire was all around Nick. But suddenly someone started talking to the guy. Reacting, Nick immediately turned around sharply. It turned out that there was a large man behind him. But then the piñata exploded, and the man said that he missed the guy. After that, he grabbed Nick and sat him down at the table. Nick was offered a good meal, but he didn't understand what was happening. Nick heard that everyone had a different way of getting through the 19th floor. Nick thought he should eat with the man. Seeing Darren devouring the food, Nick thought there might be poison in the food. But Nick calmed down, because Darren himself was poisonous, and the guy had resistance to poisons. But after trying the food, Nick was surprised, and then he started eating food just as quickly. The man said that they ate so quickly that his heart rejoiced. Soon Darren had emptied all the plates. Nick, like him, also ate too much food. But then the man suggested starting the test. Suddenly the furniture disappeared from under our heroes. It turned out that getting approval required some effort. According to the man, the food was a sign of his kindness. Suddenly, Nick felt the effect of amplification. Darren also got stronger. The man repeated that it was his kindness and suggested starting the test. After this, fire appeared on both sides. The man said that Nick needed to push through and reach that place. To this, the guy replied that he accepted the kindness with gratitude. After that, he rushed into attack. He decided to use the water skill. But the man did not suffer any harm from this. At that moment, Nick used fog acceleration. Nick decided that he didn't have to fight. But at that moment, a man blocked his path, and then he hit Nick. This made the guy step back. The man said that it was not possible to pass so easily. Nick was annoyed, but he was not going to give up. And then he attacked again. But Nick immediately realized that this wouldn't work. The next moment, the man also attacked. After defending, he quickly attacked, so Nick decided to use something. Nick used the cubes and the brooch of boiling power, and then he used an explosion. The man suggested that Nick wanted to hide in the explosion and attack. He thought it was a good approach. However, his feet were frozen to the floor. The man immediately broke the ice and said that he couldn't be caught like that. So Nick decided to take advantage of his title as a relic robber. He then used a firebomb and a cutter. The blow managed to break the opponent's shield, but did not cause any damage to the man. And then the man began to attack furiously. Nick admitted that he didn't expect to hit the man, but he really was tough. Nick had 5 relics left, but he was determined to win. The guy stood up and said that he couldn't give up. And after that, he wanted to use the ice tranquility skill. Suddenly, almost all the fire in the room went out. The man was surprised that the flame had disappeared. And then Nick activated the artificial night. The man was surprised when the monsters rushed towards him. Nick was surprised when the sacred power was also sucked out. And then the monsters began to surround the man. But suddenly, someone started to appear from the floor. And then someone's claw grabbed the man. When the man was stopped, Nick ran forward. But the enemy became very angry about this. Nick was surprised when he heard a sharp sound behind him. Having broken free from the shackles, the man said that Nick would not go there. He extended his hand forward, preparing to attack. And then a bright light appeared around him. When Nick saw this, he was very surprised. Afterwards, there was smoke from the explosion all around. But one of our heroes' swords broke. At that moment, the robber title was activated. Nick was taking a lot of damage even when defending himself with S-level relics. The man was surprised that the boy was still alive, but Nick knew that he would die from the same damage again. Then Nick decided to use his two titles. After this, his fire created both fire and ice, and then he furiously attacked the man. When the enemy saw the sword in Nick's hands, he froze in surprise. The next moment, the entire room was filled with fire and ice. Nick was surprised that he had only used the original power once, and already had such a result. Nick thought that if he knew how to use a sword, he would be more dangerous. But at that moment, his legs gave way. Then he noticed that he had arrived at his destination. At that moment, he was surprised that he hadn't even noticed how he had completed the mission. Then the man walked up to Nick and looked at him sternly. And then he asked the guy where he got the real sword of Frost Flame. The man asked how this was possible if the sword was destroyed. He begged to give him the sword, and Nick asked to stop shaking him. When Nick threw up, Darren was horrified. Afterwards, the man apologized and said that Nick most likely felt uncomfortable after eating. Nick replied that if he wanted to apologize, he should give a reward. Due to Nick's interest in his sword, the man decided to give him something special. At that moment, Nick received the Seal of Fire. Immediately, the fire seal began to be absorbed. After this, Nick received 50 points to each fire-related ability. Afterwards, he asked what the approval of the Order of Fire meant. The man replied that the boy had probably failed Magnarok's test, but he himself had not given approval for the use of the relics to their full potential. Then Nick was surprised that he could use the relics. And then the man asked if the guy would give up the sword. And in return, he offered Nick something useful. The man offered Felon's red helmet, part of a kit Nick wanted to assemble. Then Nick was surprised that the helmet was in the possession of one of the bosses, and immediately Nick decided to agree to the deal. Both heroes were happy with this deal. After Nick wanted to move on, the man wished him luck. When Nick left, the man asked someone to come out. Then Lilka said that the man could easily deal with the guy and let him go. But he replied that he hadn't had this much fun for a long time. He said he wanted to see Nick's abilities, and the last hit was incredible. But Lilka replied that it was because the man was using scrap metal. She asked mockingly if the temple support could use such a thing. Then a new shield formed in front of her. The man was surprised when he saw him. It turned out that the shield had found a suitable owner, and now the relic was awakening. Lilka said that for a long time she could not find someone who would get the dragon scales and asked if the man would now go to the 29th floor, and he sternly replied that he should do it. Lilka said that they could hate him, but he replied that he needed to take that into account. And the third dogma, according to him, was about forgiveness. After this, the man wanted to go somewhere. Then he was glad that he was finally going to Magneta. Nick, meanwhile, found himself in the safe zone of the 20th floor. Nick immediately noticed that there were fewer people here and they looked capable. Then Nick thought that Li Zun should have been here too. Nick also remembered that Lilka promised to meet on the 20th floor. It was at that moment that he saw the girl running forward. When Nick saw her, he was as surprised as she was. Grabbing Nick's hand, Lilka asked him for help. Noticing the blood at his mouth, Nick began to think about the bad. With horror, he decided that the major guilds had attacked her. But the girl brought him to the store and asked him to pay for everything. Then Nick was very surprised. He realized that these were not bloodstains, but traces of food. The store owner asked why Lilka always brought someone in and ate on credit if she had money. Overjoyed to meet her, Lilka wanted to hug Darren, but Nick dodged the girl. Then she was surprised by the guy's behavior. Lilka reminded him that Nick had promised to touch Darren and asked if his beloved girl had missed her. But Nick didn't remember that. But suddenly he was surprised and asked Darren if he was really a girl. At that moment, Nick noticed that he was attracting too much attention. Nick firmly said that if Lilka wanted to hug Darren, she had to pay the debt first. Lilka was unhappy, but she returned the entire debt. And Nick was angry that she wanted him to pay so much. Lilka was eager to touch Darren, and Nick suggested going to a quiet place. After this, Nick politely said goodbye to the owner of the counter. Entering the alley, Lilka remembered their first meeting and asked if Nick had a fetish for them. But Nick said they were there to have a quiet talk and asked if she had sold any things. Lilka said she wanted to buy Nick and Darren's scarf, and Nick asked if she knew anything about the felon set. Hearing this, the girl became thoughtful. Then Nick showed his helmet and chest plate. He collected 2, but he needed 5 more artifacts. He said that if Lilka had any of these, they could exchange them. Nick offered the crab artifact, and Lilka said it was a good thing that she couldn't get even if she wanted to. She agreed to buy it, and Nick was happy about it. But immediately after he heard that she did not have the things from the set he needed, Nick got angry and took out his sword, but Lilka said that she knew an NPC who had these things. Hearing about the right hand of the set, Nick asked to get it, but Lilka said that this was impossible, because he had not made a deal with her. He was too fixated on his territory that he didn't even talk to the girl. Nick thought it wouldn't be easy, but he had to buy that thing. Then Nick asked to give him all the information about that NPC, but Lilka demanded that they give her that artifact in return. Nick didn't want to give her the Calm of Ice, but he was ready to give her something else. Lilka agreed, but said that she would only give him information. And still, the guy had to go to the place where that NPC was. It turned out that Lilka gave him another quest. Darren yawned while Lilka explained the details to Nick. Later, they came to the place Darren asked for. Nick was angry that Lilka was still setting conditions for him. Nick said he would take care of business and Darren could rest. Then he decided to take his helmet. After putting it on, he saw his stats increase. Nick was surprised that the indicators instantly jumped, and the armor was indestructible and repaired itself. This effect was achieved with just 2 things, but Nick couldn't imagine what would happen when he collected the whole set. Then Nick discovered the community and learned about some competition. But suddenly he realized what it was about. Soon he came to the western area of the 20th floor of the tower. You had to choose a side to defend and hold back the wave of monsters, and this was the first competition in the tower that had to be completed together. To participate, Nick needed to contact an NPC and select a zone to defend. But they came to the counter again and wanted to eat. Nick noticed that there were no people in the area, and the girl replied that trading was even worse during the competition. The girl had to admit that this area was not popular. For protection, it is useful to use buildings as a barricade. But there were few buildings in the area, meaning little shelter. Nick agreed that it would be a shame to die after all his efforts. But the girl said that the points of a deceased participant were distributed among the remaining ones, and because of this, deaths were sometimes staged. Wherever you go, there will always be bad people. Nick thought that if he tried hard enough, something like this could become a good variable. There was no desire to protect this area, so buildings collapsed and trade was poor because of this. Then Nick was surprised that Lilka owed money to such a poor girl. In this competition, you had to work together, and naturally people went to where there were more people. But this meant that whoever defended the zone without participants would be able to get all the achievements. The girl sadly said that it wasn't difficult yet. Nick should go to another area and participate there. According to her, the NPS could refuse if there were too many people. But she was surprised when Nick asked if she would refuse him. He asked if he could just walk past the crying lady. Nick promised to protect the area and waited for all the points to be his. The girl said that he didn't have to do that. Suddenly, she squeezed the guy's hand with great force. Nick couldn't hide the pain after that. The girl, surprised, recoiled from Nick and apologized. Then she took off her hat and promised to explain everything she could. In the southwestern part of the floor, people were already waiting for the beginning. Old people were playing board games on the street, but they were surprised that one person was still doing his business here. They were surprised that a man could do something here alone. Then they said that if something bigger came, it would break the supports, so it was better to make traps in the ground. But the man got angry and asked why they said this only now. Then a dispute arose among the NPCs. But someone said that the man still wanted to protect them. They said that the man came here to get first place. Meanwhile, the man continued to work. Leeson was so tired the whole time that sweat was pouring off him. Meanwhile, Nick was almost ready and was looking for Darren. But the frog ate the chips calmly. Nick was happy that he was using the A-level sword he bought from Lilka for the first time. After discovering the community, Nick was surprised by the slime's desire to win the battle. Nick thought that Dixon was a strong opponent, so the slime had to be no worse. When the competition started, Nick thought it would be fun. After this, all the people were directed to the area they needed. Nick thought there might be a slime here. Suddenly, Nick's attention was drawn to a guy who had never died in all this time. Nick was surprised that he never died, despite having A's abilities. But Nick was surprised when the guy suddenly ran away. Because of this, Nick decided to look around at the other participants. Then he saw a girl who had the ability of a mechanic. Nick was surprised that the girl had AA-level abilities. Suddenly, one guy said that they needed to unite to protect this area. He said that he had a rare ability of necromancy. Afterwards, he decided to demonstrate his powers. The next moment, the goblin opened his eyes. Then he rose to his feet. It was a goblin zombie. But the guy wasn't responsible if anyone got hurt, so he asked people to be careful. And then he used his power. After that, there was an explosion. Everyone was surprised when only destroyed Earth remained in the goblin's place. While everyone was delighted, Nick understood that this was nothing compared to his bomb. Then many people wanted to join that guy. But he noticed that one person did not go to the others. So he personally invited Nick to join them. But the guy replied that he preferred to be alone. Then the guy with the creepy face answered Nick that if he wanted to join them, they would be glad. Nick read that the competition used a rating system. The competition required a nickname, and our hero decided to use the one he had been given earlier. The Evil Eye. Suddenly, some objects appeared above. Suddenly, Nick realized that Li Zun had also gone to the unpopular zone. When everyone saw the Evil Eye on the list of names, they were surprised. And then Nick decided to compete with the slime for first place. Soon, the battle began and the goblins attacked. But people began to worry because they didn't think there would be so many goblins. But only Nick was not afraid to attack the monsters. To the surprise of all the other people, he quickly rammed the monsters. The goblins attacked, but the boy fought them off every time. Everyone was surprised by the strength of our hero. But suddenly their fighting spirit rose, and they too wanted to fight back. And then they followed Nick. So Nick was followed by people who did not want to join the group. The second wave was not of goblins, but of orcs. They were much more fierce than the previous enemy. But Nick was much stronger than them. Our hero could kill them even with a stone, and the buildings behind the participants were intact. Then Nick suddenly remembered the store owner, but he was glad that the extra points for defending the buildings would be his. There were few of them, but thanks to strong players, they were able to hold out. The first of such people was Sarah. The girl could constantly create robots, and it was not a skill, but an ability. The second one was Steve. He had amazing killing skills. Nick was confident that these two players were the most outstanding in their zone. Walton believed that the Evil Eye couldn't catch all the monsters anyway, so he wanted to help. Suddenly, they found an orc who was still alive. Then they decided to split the points for this monster. Walton assured everyone that if they followed him, they would get free points. But suddenly, a stone flew into the ground next to them. Nick pretended to aim at the monster, but was actually angry at the other participants. Turning to his group, Walton said they had done nothing wrong, so they should not be afraid. And then they gathered their courage, because the Evil Eye could not kill them anyway. Nick was angry that those participants were finishing off monsters that others had caught. But at that moment, an orc approached him from behind. But then he was struck down by Nick. After killing this monster, the second wave came to an end. The second wave ended here faster than in other areas, so they were given bonus points. But Nick was surprised when he saw that he was in second place and the slime was in first place. Nick believed it was because other players took his points. Walton suggested that everyone continue to work together, guaranteeing points. But this only made Nick angry. The third wave saw the appearance of harpies. They attacked the players from behind while they weren't looking. But not all attacks were successful, as the players covered each other. Li Zun used a laser pistol and quickly dealt with the harpies. The harpies could not hide from such shots. And after the laser, even the network was used. The monsters couldn't escape from the clay net either. And then the slime blew them up. After the harpies, only land monsters remained. Intending to take first place, the slime threw something up. And then he was going to hit it with his other hand. The blow was fast and accurate on the object. And thus one orc's head was blown off. The other monsters looked at the unknown object with interest. But then the slime used release. Suddenly, light began to emanate from the object. And then the explosion destroyed almost everything in the area. Then the slime remembered how the NPCs expressed their displeasure at this trash. Thanks to this, the third wave quickly came to an end. The difference was insignificant, but this time Li Zun was faster. But he was surprised when he was not in first place, but in second. When everyone asked Walton for help, he said that it was the first time he had seen a level 3 monster. There were 3 giants in front of the players. But Walton's abilities were not enough for defense. Suddenly, he looked at a monster that resembled a dinosaur, and he was surprised that he had no chin. But at that moment, Nick attacked this monster. Then the players got angry that Nick had lured them here and now they were surrounded. But Nick knew in advance that they wouldn't be able to do anything in this area. Telling the others that he was busy, the guy continued to attack. Then everyone became sad and Walton became angry. But he decided that he needed to give the Evil Eye a hard time one last time. At that moment, Nick continued to fight. He thought he had killed many, but in reality, there were still many monsters. But Nick was glad they had Sarah and Steve. However, he saw that the two were in trouble. Then Nick was surprised that his comrades couldn't cope. But it turned out that Walton was leading all the people after Sarah. Nick immediately realized that the guy was up to no good. Nick took on one part of the monsters, and those that split into two parts were killed by Sarah and Steve. But Walton started running away from the monsters, so the plan fell apart. To survive, this guy put others in danger. Walton wanted to take the points of the losers, and because of this, he was already in 78th place. He understood that if the others died, he would rise to 30th place. Soon, Nick saw Walton running towards Sarah. He was angry that Walton wanted to take the glasses of the dead, but he himself had the ability to pretend to be dead. Nick ran forward with a jerk. At that moment, Sarah was squeezed from all sides. Suddenly, the girl heard someone calling her, and then Nick grabbed her hand, and then he threw it into the sky, remaining on the ground. The next moment, all the monsters pounced on Nick. However, the temperature in the area immediately dropped, and all the monsters were covered in ice. Almost immediately, their bodies began to disintegrate. And almost immediately after that, Nick caught Sarah as she fell. The girl wanted to thank her, but Nick interrupted her, and after that, they jumped high into the sky. When Nick came down to Steve, everyone was surprised. Then Nick decided to help Steve too. Having dealt with the monsters, he grabbed the guy by the collar, and then he also dragged him away from a pile of monsters. Walton saw an explosion in the distance. Soon he saw the evil eye. Pointing to the guy, he told his men that they could survive there. When Nick heard the cries for help, he immediately turned around. The people running after Walton asked Nick for help. Then Nick decided to intervene and killed the monsters chasing them. At that time, people could not believe that they had survived. Immediately, everyone ran up to Nick and said that they would follow him. And Walton was glad that, as he said, they were able to survive. But Nick approached him and said that Walton was not. Then Nick was going to use the protective wall. The will of the defender was activated. Using it, Nick dragged the guy along with him, and then he threw him to the ground. Walton demanded to be let inside, but it was impossible. The guy kept insisting that he saved everyone. But Nick answered him that most of all, he despised people like him. And after that, he left Walton alone. In horror, the boy simply asked the evil eye for help. But almost immediately, monsters appeared in the area. They all pounced on the guy when he asked to be let inside. The next moment, everyone saw notifications that Walton had died. Because of this, Nick decided that he needed to wrap it up too. Sarah and Steve weren't sure the evil eye could handle all those monsters on its own. Steve was amazed that the guy took on the monsters to save others. But suddenly they saw a strong flash. An explosion thundered in the middle of the city. Then everyone was surprised, not understanding what kind of explosion it was. At that moment, the protection was canceled. Then everyone thought that the evil eye had died, so the protection had worn off. But Nick told everyone that it was all over and they could rest easy. Their zone also received extra points for completing the task faster than everyone else. At that moment, everyone began to praise the evil eye. Many fell at his feet, thanking him for saving them. But Nick assured everyone that all this was in the past. Then Sarah and Steve approached him and decided to get to know each other. Sarah said she saw the evil eye fight on the 10th floor and save the bald man. Steve didn't see it, but said he heard about it in the community. It suddenly turned out that Steve was also a fan of the beautiful princess. But Nick asked if they hadn't avoided him in the beginning. Steve said they didn't know if the evil eye could be trusted. Sarah said that they were also followers of the princess and were able to become stronger thanks to her. When Nick was asked if he was a member of the KPL club, he did not understand what was being discussed. It turned out that this was not a guild, but simply a club created by the princess's followers, where people communicated and exchanged information. It turned out that the club was created by Jin, who personally spoke with the princess. Nick was surprised that even Jean decided to create a fan club, but he was even more surprised when he heard that he did not take first place. Nick saw that he had a very big gap with the slime. This was because the slime was the only one surviving in its area. That's why I was able to get points for all the waves. When he started to leave, everyone tried to stop the evil eye, but Nick calmly replied that he needed first place. Afterwards, he walked to the edge of the fence and took out his sword. He was notified that he could not leave the zone until the competition was over. Taking out his sword, he said that it was time to justify his price. According to the information about the sword, it could break through the boundaries of anything. Nick swung and struck. Having broken the fence, he apologized to the slime in advance for taking first place. After a while, the slime was glad that victory would be his. He started thinking in advance about how he would tease the bald guy, but suddenly he saw that changes were taking place in the rankings. Then he took off his helmet and threw it away in anger. Sylvia was angry that Nick had passed her even though he had run out of waves. Sylvia was angry that he had even more points. She promised herself that the next time they met, she would definitely win the evil eye. It turns out the girl was a gold medalist in volleyball. But while she was thinking about this, the points continued to rise. After this, all boundaries disappeared and the competition ended. Suddenly, someone turned to Sylvia. 3 guilds at once joyfully greeted the girl. Someone offered the girl some water. When the girl prepared to fight, she was told that they were not there to fight. Everyone said that they didn't even have weapons. Someone even offered her a gift, wanting to convey to the beautiful princess that they were not bad people. The girl realized that through her, the guilds wanted to establish relations with the princess and Dixon. Meanwhile, everyone continued to praise the girl. However, Sylvia was angry that she got second place. Angered, she admitted that she was in second place and asked if she should kill them all. In gratitude for his help, the shop owner treated Nick to something. But Nick was outraged that Darren and Lilka did nothing but wanted to eat. Lilka joked that the owner allowed her to eat, and Nick simply proved that he was greedy. But Nick knew that Lilka had repaid the debt with interest so that Bella would have more money for her recovery. Thinking that Lilka was being frivolous, the guy chuckled. When Nick logged into the community and learned that guilds had contacted the liquor to ask him to sell them skills, he just chuckled. Nick thought that he shouldn't sit idle and should go higher. But suddenly he wanted to ask Lilka something. Pointing to the parchment, he asked her if she knew what it was. But Lilka didn't know what it was either. Suddenly Bella said that she had the same thing. When Nick was surprised that NPCs could do something like that, Lilka asked how they would give quests then.